Hi guys, welcome to HistSleep. A quiet dawn in the medieval fields morning was not loud. It was never loud in the Middle Ages. At least, not here, in this small corner of forgotten countryside. The sun rose as it always had, patient and pale, spilling its first light across dew-covered fields. A thin mist rolled low to the ground, soft as breath, wrapping every furrow and fence post in silver silence. There were no engines, no alarms, no hurry, only the slow awakening of earth itself. A single bird called out from the hedgerow, then another. The sound drifted like music, a kind that no one composed, yet everyone depended on. In a cottage near the edge of the meadow, a man stirred from his straw bed. His name is not written in any book, but his work was. He was a farmer, not by choice, but by birth, as his father was before him. His hands knew the soil better than they knew prayer. He pushed open a wooden door swollen with age. Outside, the air was cool and damp, smelling of hay, ash, and earth. A rooster crowed somewhere behind the barn, late, lazy, like the man himself. He smiled at the sound and tightened the wool shawl around his shoulders. The day would be long, but not unkind in the distance. The church bell rang once, not to summon, but to remind. It marked the hour when all of life began again. Animals fed, fires rekindled, and the first footsteps pressed into the mud. Every villager knew the rhythm, though no one spoke of it. It was simply how things were done. The farmer's name might have been John, or Thomas, or something simpler still. He lived with his wife and 2 children in a hut of wattle and daub, its roof patched with moss and hope. They owned almost nothing. A few tools, a goat, and a patch of ground blessed by sun and cursed by frost. But that small plot was enough to keep them alive, and enough to remind them that the land itself had memory. As John walked to his field, his boots sank softly into the mud. Every step felt the same as the one before, and yet each was slightly different, the weight of the season pressing down in new ways. He looked out across the furrows, where the crops from last year had faded into ghosts of green. But he knew something others might forget. Not all crops die when the winter ends. Some sleep, some wait, some remember. He reached the edge of the field and knelt beside a patch of plants that refused to surrender. Even after months of snow and cold wind, their stalks still held color, faint, but alive. Lovage, perhaps, or good King Henry. He couldn't read or write their names, but he knew their scent, their taste, their stubbornness. He smiled again. "You've come back." Then he whispered to the leaves. The field stretched far beyond his eyes. It wasn't large by any noble measure, but it was endless in another way. In memory, in rhythm, in patience. Here, the land and the man were one thing. When he worked, the earth breathed with him. When he rested, it rested too. The village itself was waking now. Faint voices, the creak of a cart, the bark of a tired dog. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, hesitant lines. And still, the world remained slow, the kind of slowness that made time seem circular, like the rings of a tree trunk, always returning to its beginning. In a world without clocks, people lived by color and shadow. When the light turned gold, they knew it was time to begin. When it turned blue, it was time to rest. And between those hours stretched everything that mattered. Toil, talk, prayer, laughter, and the steady pulse of the soil. The farmer took up his hoe and began to turn the ground. Softly, almost respectfully. He didn't dig deep. He didn't have to. The roots of the old crops were still there, waiting, holding secrets from the year before. He knew, without needing to think, that if he simply loosened the soil, not too much, not too fast, the plants would return. It was not work. It was a conversation. The sound of metal meeting earth was steady, slow, like a heartbeat. He hummed a tune his grandmother used to sing, a wordless melody of seed and sun, the kind of song that only makes sense in the company of soil. His daughter, small and barefoot, came running down the path with a wooden cup of milk. Her laughter startled the birds from the hedges. "Papa," she said, her voice bright, "the hens are awake." He smiled without looking up. "Then the world is safe," he replied. She didn't understand, but she nodded as if she did. Behind them, the hills began to glow with morning. Fields of barley and rye shimmered in the light like seas of gold. Somewhere, a shepherd called to his flock. His voice echoed softly through the valley. Everything, it seemed, was alive, yet nothing hurried. The farmer paused to straighten his back. He looked over the land with eyes that saw both the present and the past. His father had worked this same field. His grandfather, too, each had planted, harvested, and waited, trusting that the earth would do its part. They had no science for it, no written record, only the quiet faith that some things, once planted, never truly die. He turned the soil again and uncovered a small clump of roots, white and tender. He brushed away the dirt and held it to the light. Even through the roughness of his palms, he could feel its life, faint but certain. He pressed it gently back into the ground. The rhythm continued. Lift, turn, rest, breathe. The mist began to fade. The sun rose higher, spilling warmth across the fields. A low wind drifted through, carrying the scent of thyme and damp straw. It was the same air that had touched Roman stones and Viking sails. Time moved differently here. It didn't march. It circled. Soon, his wife appeared with a basket of bread. They ate in silence, sitting on the edge of the furrow. The crust was hard, the air soft. In that balance, life felt complete. After the meal, he lay back and looked at the sky, a gray so pale it almost seemed white. Crows circled overhead, black and deliberate. He wondered if they too remembered every harvest, every seed. The village bell rang again. This time for mid-morning. He rose, brushed the dirt from his knees, and took a long breath. His work would continue until the light faded, and even then, the plants would keep working beneath the soil, quietly, endlessly. By afternoon, the field had changed color. The soil, freshly turned, looked darker, richer, alive. He could almost hear it breathing. He whispered a prayer without words, a gratitude born not of religion, but of rhythm. "May you grow," he murmured to the roots. "May you return." He didn't know that, centuries later, historians would write of these very crops, the perennials that outlasted kings, wars, and plagues. He didn't know that modern gardens would still carry their seeds. He only knew what the land told him. that life, when treated gently, gives back as evening neared. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the furrows like long fingers. The world grew quieter again, not empty, but full of peace. A final breeze passed through the lovage leaves, and they shimmered faintly in the dying light. The man gathered his tools and began the slow walk home. Behind him, the field remained still, breathing, remembering. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. The earth, he knew, would keep its promise. Seeds of eternitide night had passed without noise. When morning came again, the mist lingered low, reluctant to leave the valley in the soft silence of dawn. The field still carried the scent of wet earth and smoke. It was a new day, yet it felt like the same one returning, as if time itself had folded back upon the land. For the medieval farmer, time was not a straight line. It was a circle, round as the moon, round as a seed, round as the endless seasons that came and went but never truly departed. And within that circle lay the farmer's greatest secret. Some seeds never really die. He stood at the edge of the field again, the same way he had stood yesterday, and the day before, and the year before that. The same boots, the same soil, the same quiet gratitude. He reached into his old leather pouch, the one his father had carried before him. Inside, a handful of seeds waited, small, brown, nearly weightless. They looked like nothing, but they were, in truth, time made visible. He turned one between his fingers. How many centuries had seeds like this endured? How many winters had they slept beneath the frost, unseen but alive? It was said among the villagers that some of these plants could last forever, that once you planted them, they returned every year. As if guided by memory alone, God made trees eternal, the priest had once said, but the soil made these little ones clever. The farmer smiled at the thought. He didn't know about eternity or cleverness, but he knew one thing. The land remembered each winter. He had watched his fields turn to gray. Each spring, he had watched them glow green again, and though his hands grew older and slower with every passing season, the crops seemed unchanged, the same shapes, the same scents, the same stubborn life. He knelt down and brushed the soil aside with his fingers. It was damp, cool, and alive. Tiny roots wove through it like threads in an old tapestry. He dropped one seed into the hollow and pressed the earth gently above it. Not a burial, but a promise. From the cottages nearby came faint sounds. A baby's cry, the crackle of firewood, the ring of a bucket on stone. The world was waking, slowly, without rush. He could hear his wife humming in the distance, grinding grain for the morning bread, her voice mixed with the sound of the wind, soft and steady. The man planted another seed, then another. Each fell into the earth like a word whispered in prayer. It wasn't the kind of prayer one said in church, but one spoken directly to the soil. He asked for nothing, promised nothing. He only trusted, because in this world, trust was the truest form of survival. When famine came, when storms tore through the valley, when blight ruined the grain, the perennials, the forever plants, were what saved them. Lovage, sorrel, chives, good King Henry. They needed no sowing, no pleading. They simply returned. Every time. The villagers sometimes said these crops carried souls, that the spirits of old farmers lingered in their roots, refusing to let the land go barren. No one really believed it. And yet, no one dared disturb the old patches. Either to uproot a perennial was to break a silent pact with the past. In one corner of his field stood a patch of leeks that had been there longer than memory. His grandfather said his grandfather had first planted them. And still, each spring, Green shoots rose like slender candles from the same ground. He had tried once, long ago, to pull them all up. They had simply grown back, thicker, stronger, as if to prove a point. He learned then that some things are not meant to be started over. Some things are meant to continue. As he worked, a small robin followed him, hopping from clod to clod, searching for worms in the fresh soil. The farmer smiled and spoke to it softly. "Little one," he said, "you remember to, don't you?" The bird tilted its head as though it understood. Then it flew to the fence and began to sing. The air smelled of new life, wet grass, smoke, and something sweeter he couldn't name. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was memory. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. At the edge of the property, a young boy from the village approached. He carried a small bundle under his arm, dry twigs and roots tied with twine. "Father says to give you these," the boy said, shyly. "He says they're from the monastery garden." The farmer accepted them carefully. The roots were pale, knotted, and alive. "Tell your father thank you," he said, "and tell him the monks still remember the old ways." The boy nodded and ran back toward the village, his boots splashing in the mud. The farmer studied the roots for a moment. He recognized one immediately, a cutting of good King Henry. The old spinach of the peasants. It was said to heal fevers, feed families, and never fade. He smiled again and pressed it into the soil beside his other plants. From the hill above, the sound of bells drifted faintly, the monastery calling the monks to prime. The morning prayer. He had been inside that chapel once, years ago, when his son was sick. He remembered the smell of incense, the coolness of stone, the rows of herbs drying along the window sills. Those monks were gardeners, too, keepers of green knowledge when the world outside was ruled by steel and hunger. They called their gardens living scriptures. Every leaf had meaning. Every seed held memory to them. Planting was a holy act, a way of participating in creation. Quietly, humbly, forever. The farmer wasn't a monk, but he felt the same peace when he worked his soil. It was his way of listening to the earth's language, one that had no words but endless wisdom. Every time he planted a seed, he felt connected not just to his land, but to something larger, older, infinite. He looked toward the western ridge, where his ancestors had been buried beneath the oak trees. He wondered if, in some secret way, the roots of his crops reached them, if the life of the soil was one long chain, unbroken, seed to root, root to bone, bone to dust, dust to seed again. The thought comforted him. Midday came slowly, warm and golden. The mist had vanished, replaced by the hum of bees and the murmur of wind through the grass. He took a break and sat under a small tree, sipping from a flask of ale. The air was alive with movement. Insects, birds, the rustle of leaves. But beneath all that noise was something quieter, the steady heartbeat of the land. He watched the field shimmer in the sunlight. He knew, deep down, that he would not live to see all that these seeds would become. Some would rise when he was gone. Some would still rise when his children's children were old. And that thought brought him a strange kind of peace. It was not eternity in the way the church described it, golden gates and trumpets and light. No, this was a gentler eternity, one that lived in roots and rain, in soil and silence, an eternity that asked for nothing but care. He stood again and walked to the far end of the field, where wild flowers tangled with weeds. There, among them, grew an old rhubarb plant, its stalks red as rust. He hadn't planted it. No one had. It had been there for as long as he could remember, perhaps longer. He touched its leaves, broad and heavy with dew. "You're older than me," he whispered. Older than my father, maybe. The plant said nothing, but it didn't need to. Its presence was enough. Nearby, a cluster of chives swayed gently, their purple blossoms catching the light. They smelled faintly of onion and rain. He plucked one stalk, chewed thoughtfully, and felt its sharp taste wake his senses. It was a humble plant, small, overlooked, yet it had likely been growing here since the days when knights still roamed these hills. That realization filled him with quiet awe. He was not the owner of this land. He was merely its caretaker. For a while, and the plants, those eternal companions, would remain long after his name was forgotten. When the sun began to dip behind the trees, he gathered his things. The day's planting was done. Though his work was never truly finished, he looked over the field one last time. The faint rose of turned earth, the patches of green, the whisper of the wind weaving through it all. It looked ordinary, but he knew it was not. Beneath the soil, life had already begun, tiny roots unfurling, old ones awakening, the eternal conversation between earth and seed resuming once again. He felt a calm that went deeper than contentment. It was the calm of knowing that nothing, not even time, could truly erase what had been planted with care. As twilight settled, he walked home slowly, the pouch of seeds lighter now. He passed the same path his ancestors had walked, the same stones, the same hedges. The air was cool again, carrying the scent of smoke from the evening fires. Children laughed somewhere behind him. A dog barked once, then fell silent. He reached his cottage and placed the empty pouch on the table. His wife looked up from the hearth and smiled. All done? She asked. He nodded. For today, he said, but they'll come back. She didn't ask who they were. She knew. Outside, the fields darkened under a sky thick with stars. Each one seemed like a seed itself, small, shining, patient, scattered across the black soil of the heavens. And in that vast, eternal field, the farmer felt a kinship. He belonged to the same pattern, the same rhythm, the same quiet eternity. The wind moved through the open door and stirred the ashes in the hearth. He watched the embers glow, fade, then glow again. Just like the seeds, just like the seasons, just like everything that learns how to stay alive by letting go. He closed his eyes and listened to the night breathing. The world turned slowly, gently, eternally, and beneath its turning, the seeds dreamed on. The secret of the perennial garden. The rain had come softly in the night. By dawn, the air was heavy with the scent of wet soil and crushed grass. The farmer woke before the first bell of the monastery sounded, as he always did, guided not by time but by the whisper of the land. He opened the door and stepped outside into the silver morning. The world was quiet but alive. Droplets clung to every leaf, every blade of grass, turning the field into a sea of small mirrors. The sky hung low and pale, a soft gray that felt almost kind. He took a deep breath, and for a moment, the world felt sacred in the distance. The monastery garden shimmered faintly through the mist. It sat behind stone walls, ancient and orderly, hidden from most eyes. But those who had seen it spoke of it in hushed tones. A place where plants never seemed to die, where each generation of monks tended the same roots, planted centuries before. They called it the perennial garden. Few outside the monastery knew its true secret. It was said that the garden was not blessed by miracle, nor guarded by magic, only by memory and patience. And yet, to those who walked its narrow paths, it did feel holy. The earth there was dark and rich, always moist, always alive. The plants grew in harmony, herbs, vegetables, flowers, all mingling like voices in a choir, each one supporting the others in unseen ways. The farmer had never been inside, but he felt its presence each day. The wind that passed over its walls carried a distinct fragrance: rosemary, lovage, thyme, ancient scents that spoke of health and endurance. Sometimes, he imagined that those seeds drifted beyond the walls, finding their way to his own humble fields. Perhaps that was the garden's quiet generosity, to share without being seen. That morning, as the clouds began to break, he decided to visit. It was not far, only a short walk along a narrow dirt path lined with willows and stones. His wife, seeing him leave, handed him a small bundle of bread and cheese. "For the monks," she said simply. He nodded. The gift was small, but kindness, he knew, grew in the same way as the perennials. Planted once, it lasted long. The path wound upward toward the monastery hill. Birdsong echoed faintly in the distance, mingling with the slow toll of the morning bell. He walked without hurry. His steps were steady, his thoughts clear. The air grew cooler as he climbed, and the smell of herbs thickened. When he reached the monastery gate, an old monk stood waiting, wrapped in a brown robe faded by time. His face was thin but kind, his eyes bright with a light that no candle could mimic. "Peace upon you," the monk said, "and upon your garden," the farmer replied. The monk smiled, a small curve of lips that felt like the rising of the sun. "You've come to see it," he said, though the farmer hadn't spoken his reason. "Yes," the farmer said softly, "if it pleases God, then it will please him," the monk replied. He led the farmer through the stone archway into the garden. The moment they stepped inside, the world changed. The air was warmer, almost glowing. Bees drifted lazily from flower to flower, and a stream murmured quietly through the middle of the space. The scent of mint and sage filled the air like old prayers. Everywhere he looked, something grew, not in neat rows, but in gentle patterns that seemed born of wisdom rather than planning. Lovage towered beside thyme, rhubarb curled beneath chives, strawberries crept through patches of comfrey, their small red fruit glinting in the morning light. It was wild and orderly all at once, a living harmony. The monk paused beside a patch of green. "These," he said, touching the leaves lightly, "were planted before I was born, and before my teacher was born, and before his teacher, and his teacher after that." He smiled. "They have never left us. They die in winter, but only to rest. They wake again when the world is ready." The farmer knelt, brushing the soil with his hand. It was soft, deep, breathing. He could feel warmth beneath the surface, as if the earth itself carried a heartbeat. He whispered, almost to himself, "How do you keep them alive so long?" The monk's eyes softened. "We do not keep them," he said. "We care for them. That is different." He gestured to the plants around them. "Each one gives something the other needs. The tall ones shade the small. The deep roots pull water up for the shallow ones. When a leaf falls, it feeds the soil. When a plant dies, it becomes another's cradle. Nothing here stands alone." The farmer listened as if he were hearing the language of the world for the first time. He had always known the land was alive, but never had he thought of it as a conversation. He watched the bees moving among the flowers and wondered if they carried messages between the plants, as monks carried prayers between heaven and earth. "Every spring," the monk continued, "we do not plant anew. We only tend. We loosen the soil. We share the roots. We thank the old stalks for returning. It is not work. It is gratitude." The farmer looked around the garden again. He could see the truth of the monk's words. There was no rush, no force, The plants seemed to grow because they wanted to, because they trusted the hands that cared for them. Some say it is a miracle, the monk said softly. But it is not. It is simply patience, the kind that men forget, and the earth remembers. The farmer's eyes wandered to a small corner of the garden, where a group of young novices were kneeling beside a patch of asparagus. They worked silently, lifting the soil with wooden tools, their movements slow and deliberate. One of them looked up and smiled at him, a boy no older than his own son. In that smile, the farmer saw something ancient, a peace that comes only from knowing one's place in the pattern of things. The monk motioned toward the center of the garden. "Come," he said. "There is something I wish to show you." They walked along a stone path bordered by marigolds and mint until they reached an old oak tree. Its roots spread wide and deep, twisting like veins through the ground at its base. The soil was dark and fragrant, full of life. "This tree," the monk said, "was planted when this monastery was built. Every year, it sheds its leaves, and those leaves feed the garden. We take nothing that the earth does not first offer." He bent down, scooped a handful of soil, and held it out to the farmer. "This," he said, "is our secret. Not a seed, not a prayer. Just this. Soil that remembers." The farmer took the handful, crumbling it gently between his fingers. He could feel the moisture, the life within it. It was not dirt. It was memory made matter. He understood then that this was the heart of the perennial garden. Continuity. The monk continued. "When the world beyond these walls changes, when kings fall and wars rise, this garden does not notice. It keeps its rhythm, birth, rest, decay, return. Always the same, always true." The farmer nodded. He could feel the truth of those words deep within him. His own field was part of this rhythm too, even if he had never named it. The soil beneath his feet carried the same story. The story of things that endure by yielding, of life that returns through stillness. The monk smiled again. "You understand," he said quietly. The farmer bowed his head. "I think I always have," he replied. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the herbs. The bees hummed like distant choirs. The stream murmured secrets older than both men combined. Finally, the monk spoke once more. "Take what you have seen and remember it. You need no relic, no blessing. Just remember that everything which endures does so by sharing, not by holding." The farmer thanked him, and together they walked back toward the gate. Before leaving, the monk reached into a small pouch and handed the farmer a cluster of dried roots wrapped in cloth. "Plant these," he said. "They will not feed you quickly, but they will never leave you." The farmer accepted them reverently. When he stepped outside, the light had changed. The sky was clearing, and the valley below glowed with a soft gold. He could see his own field in the distance, small but steady, waiting. He smiled to himself as he walked home. He could still smell the monastery's garden clinging to his clothes, the scent of mint and thyme, of patience and peace. He felt lighter somehow, though he carried the weight of the roots in his hands. For the first time, he understood what the monks had learned long ago, that the true secret of the perennial garden is not that it lives forever, but that it teaches how to live in rhythm with forever. When he reached his field again, he knelt beside the soil and pressed the roots gently into the earth. The air was still, as if the land itself was listening. He whispered, "Grow, and remember." And though he would never know it, centuries later, those same plants would still be growing there, unbothered by time, untouched by forgetting, carrying forward the quiet secret of the perennial garden. Lovage. The forgotten jaunt. By the time summer arrived in the valley, The farmer's field had changed. The young shoots he had planted after his visit to the monastery were no longer small, uncertain things. They stood tall now, strong and fragrant, their hollow stems reaching toward the sun. The leaves, broad and dark, swayed softly in the breeze like the slow breathing of the earth itself. Among them, one plant grew taller than the rest. It was neither tree nor herb, neither wild nor tame. Its scent was unlike anything he had known, a deep, warming fragrance that carried hints of celery, anise, and something sweetly ancient. It was called Lovage. The farmer remembered the old monk's words when he had given him those roots. "They will not feed you quickly," he'd said, "but they will never leave you." He hadn't understood it then. Now, standing among the towering stalks, he began to. Lovage was a patient creature. While other herbs wilted in the first heat, Lovage thrived. Its roots dug deep, far below the reach of drought or frost. Its leaves, when crushed between the fingers, released a scent that felt like a memory, sharp, sweet, and strangely comforting. The farmer had planted it near the edge of the field, where the soil was richest and the wind strongest. Yet even there, Lovage stood unbent. It did not bow to storms. It did not complain when the rain delayed or when the sun burned to hot. It grew quietly, steadily, as if it carried its own weather inside. The villagers who passed his land began to notice. "What is that?" they would ask, pointing to the tall green giants that now stood watch over his fields. The farmer would smile. "Lovage," he'd say simply. Some would wrinkle their brows. Others would nod vaguely, as if recalling the name from a grandmother's tale or a forgotten recipe. Few knew its story, but in truth, Lovage had once been famous, a plant beloved across the medieval world. The Romans had carried it north across the Alps, tucking its seeds in leather pouches beside gold and salt. Medieval cooks prized it above pepper. Monks grew it beside their infirmaries. Travelers tucked it into their boots to keep their feet fresh on long journeys. It flavored soups, healed wounds, and soothed weary hearts. But time, as it often does, forgot. The great herb gardens fell silent. New spices came from distant lands: cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, and Lovage slipped quietly into the shadows of memory. By the time the farmer planted his first root, few in the valley could even name it. And yet, here it stood, thriving, ancient, eternal in the soft gold of late afternoon. The farmer would walk among the lovage and listen to the hum of bees. Their wings made a sound like faint chanting, a low hymn that never stopped. The air was heavy with perfume. He found peace there, the kind that spoke not in words but in stillness. Sometimes he would sit beneath the tallest stalk and run, his hand through the soil at its base. The roots, he imagined, reached down like fingers, gripping stories older than kings. He thought of the monastery's garden and wondered if the same line of lovage still grew there, a silent kinship between his field and theirs. His wife began to use it in their meals. She chopped its leaves into soups and stews, crushed its seeds into bread, and brewed its stems into tonics that warmed the stomach and cleared the chest. Their children, at first skeptical, grew to love the taste, a bright, peppery warmth that lingered like a song. Visitors to their home would marvel at the aroma drifting from the hearth. "What spice is that?" they'd ask, and she would smile. "Not spice, memory." At market, word began to spread. People came from neighboring villages to trade for small bundles of the fragrant leaves. A few brought coins, others brought grain or wool. The farmer never asked much. A fair exchange was enough. He knew the plant would return each spring regardless of payment. It asked for nothing but soil, water, and patience. One day, a traveler stopped by his field. An old man with a cloak of faded green and a walking staff carved with symbols. He bent over one of the plants, brushing the leaves between his fingers, and inhaled deeply. "I haven't smelled this in 50 years," he said softly. "It used to grow in the kitchens of kings." The farmer offered him water, and they sat together beneath the shade of the lovage stalks. The travelers spoke of distant lands, of abbeys where the herb once filled the air with fragrance, of healers who used its oil to mend wounds and calm fevers, of sailors who carried it to sea for strength. Lovage, the traveler said, was once a guardian. Every garden had one, because it reminded people that endurance is its own kind of power. The farmer nodded, his gaze soft on the waving leaves. "I believe that," he said quietly. When the traveler left, he pressed a single lovage seed into the man's hand. "Plant it where no one remembers," he said, "and it will teach them to remember again." The old man smiled and disappeared down the road. That night, the farmer sat by the fire with his family. He told them what he had learned, how Lovage had once traveled the world, how it had fed and healed and endured through centuries. His wife listened with her hands still on the spinning wheel. His eldest son leaned forward, eyes wide. "Will it live forever?" the boy asked. The farmer smiled. "As long as someone remembers to plant it." Outside, the night wind brushed gently against the leaves. The lovage whispered in its tall, hollow voice, a sound like breath through an ancient flute. It was not loud, not proud, but certain. As summer deepened, the lovage flowered. Umbels of tiny yellow-green blossoms unfolded like stars across the field. Bees gathered around them in slow, lazy circles. The air shimmered with heat and fragrance. From a distance, the field looked like a small forest of emerald spires swaying beneath a silver sky. The farmer harvested sparingly, a few leaves here, a few seeds there. He never cut more than the plants offered. He knew now what the monk had meant. To tend was not to take, to harvest forever. One must never exhaust the source. In autumn, when the first frost brushed the valley, the lovage bowed gracefully. Its leaves yellowed, its stalks leaned, and the scent of the field grew softer, deeper, like a lullaby fading into sleep. The farmer gathered the seeds, storing them in small clay jars. Each jar he labeled with care. "Lovage, year of our Lord 1352. He smiled as he did so, though he knew no one might read the words for 100 years. When winter came, the stalks withered completely. The field fell silent under snow. But the farmer did not grieve. He had seen enough springs to know that the silence was not an ending. The roots still lived below, dreaming in the dark. Sometimes, in the long quiet of winter nights, he would take one of the jars of seeds from the shelf and shake it gently beside the fire. The tiny sound they made, the soft rattle of dry life, waiting, comforted him more than any prayer. He would close his eyes and imagine the green giants rising again, reaching toward the sun, unchanged by time and beyond the walls of his home. Beneath layers of snow and soil, the lovage slept peacefully, patient as ever it had survived. Empires and forgotten languages it would survive this winter too. Lovage did not. Hurry it never had it was content to wait for the world to remember it. Because somewhere, in some quiet field, someone always would. Good King Henry, the peasants spinach in the soft light of another spring, when frost still clung to the shadows of the hedgerows. Something green began to stir once more in the farmer's field. It was smaller than lovage, humbler than the proud herbs that grew beside it. Yet somehow, it seemed just as determined. Its leaves pushed through the earth with quiet confidence. broad and velvety, shaped like hearts. The farmer noticed it first one morning as he bent to check the rows near his cottage door. He brushed the soil aside and smiled. "There you are again," he whispered. It had returned, just as it always did, without asking for care or praise. He called it Good King Henry. The name sounded royal, though the plant itself was not. There were no crowns in its leaves, no jewels in its flowers, only a deep green steadiness. It was the people's plant, the peasants' spinach, born of hard soil and hard lives. It grew where other crops failed, behind barns, beside wells, in corners no lord would bother to claim. Good King Henry had been with the farmer's family longer than memory. His grandmother had once cooked its leaves in a pot of barley broth his mother had gathered its tender shoots in early spring when nothing else would grow. It was food for hunger, medicine for weakness, and comfort for those who could afford neither feast nor feast day. In the village, people spoke of it with affection, as if it were a neighbor. "Henry's up early this year," they would say, or "We'll eat like kings tonight." They laughed at the irony, but in truth, the plant deserved its crown. Good King Henry was a survivor, a perennial that asked for nothing and gave everything. Its leaves were rich and strong, its roots deep, its seeds self-sown. Even when trampled or forgotten, it would return each spring, faithful as dawn. The farmer often thought about that, how some plants, like people, seem born to endure quietly, without reward or recognition. While nobles feasted on imported spices, his village feasted on what the earth itself provided, and in that simplicity, there was a kind of nobility no gold could match. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the farmer's wife knelt beside the patch of Good King Henry near their cottage door. She gathered a handful of leaves, shaking the soil from their roots. Her hands were weathered but gentle. She placed the harvest in a wooden bowl and carried it inside, where the smell of wood smoke and bread filled the air. The children were waiting by the hearth. Their bellies had known lean days before, but tonight there was promise in the mother added the greens to a bubbling stew, their color deepening to a rich, dark green as they softened in the heat. The scent that rose was earthy, warm, alive. When they ate, no one spoke for a while. The taste was simple but full, a flavor of the soil itself. Honest and grounding, it reminded them that life, even in hardship, could still offer small, steadfast joys. After supper, the farmer sat outside beneath the pale stars. The field shimmered faintly in the moonlight, the Lovage tall and silver, the Good King Henry low and dark like shadows at its feet. He thought of how the two plants stood together, the giant and the humble, side by side in harmony. Each had its place, its purpose. The land, it seemed, needed both in time. The farmer began to share Good King Henry with others. He carried bundles of it to the market, offering it to those who had never seen it before. Some turned it away, preferring more fashionable greens, brought from distant towns. But the older folk, the ones with dirt beneath their fingernails and patience in their hearts, knew its worth at a glance. An old woman once traded him a loaf of rye bread for a handful of Henry leaves. As she tucked them into her basket, she said softly, "My mother called it poor man's asparagus, but she said the name was wrong. It's not poor, it's loyal." The farmer nodded. "Aye," he replied, "loyal things live longest." By midsummer, the plant had spread beyond the garden's edge, creeping into the cracks between stones, sprouting beside the path. Even growing near the church wall where the ground was thin, it seemed to thrive on neglect. And yet, wherever it grew, the soil grew stronger too. The monks from the nearby monastery came one morning to ask for cuttings. They had heard of the farmer's success with perennial herbs and wished to plant their own. The eldest among them, a quiet man with kind eyes, knelt beside the patch of good King Henry and smiled. "This one," he said, "was in our old texts. We lost it centuries ago." He lifted a leaf gently between his fingers. "To think it survived here all along." The farmer helped them gather seeds, wrapping them in linen. Before they left, the monk said, "Plants like this are God's memory. When men forget, the soil remembers." The farmer liked that thought. He repeated it often in the weeks that followed, as if the words themselves were a kind of seed through the long days of summer. The plant continued to flourish. Its small yellow-green flowers turned to seed, and the farmer scattered them gently across the fallow plots. He didn't need to water them much. Good King Henry knew how to survive the dry months. When the rains came, it spread even further, its roots binding the soil like quiet threads of resilience. In the evenings, he would sometimes crush a leaf between his fingers and breathe in its scent. It smelled like rain and iron and home. He found himself thinking that perhaps it wasn't just a plant. Perhaps it was a message from the past, a small act of defiance against the forgetting of simple things. When autumn arrived, the leaves grew darker, tinged with bronze. The stalks stood proudly even as the nights turned cold. Other crops withered and fell, but good King Henry endured. It was never the first to bloom, nor the most beautiful, but it was the last to fade. And that, to the farmer, seemed a kind of wisdom. One day, a nobleman's steward passed through the village. He saw the green patch near the farmer's home and laughed. "You peasants eat weeds," he said, sneering. The farmer only smiled. "Then it's the weeds that keep us alive." He didn't say it with anger, only quiet truth. The steward rode away without reply, and the farmer returned to his work, humming softly to himself. That night, as the wind brushed through the fields, the good King Henry leaves rustled in reply. A sound like laughter, patient and kind. As winter approached once again, the farmer harvested the last of the leaves and let the rest return to the earth. He covered the ground lightly with straw, whispering a small prayer for the roots below. He knew that when spring returned, they would rise again, unchanged, undeterred. UNFORGOTTEN. In the dead of winter, when snow covered everything, he sometimes dreamt of the plant. In his dreams, the leaves glowed faintly green beneath the frost, pulsing like quiet hearts. He would wake before dawn and look out across the field, half expecting to see them shining in the moonlight. The seasons turned again, and so did the story. New hands would one day plant the same seeds, not knowing his name but reaping his patience. And through it all, good King Henry would remain loyal, humble, eternal. For the land, after all, does not care for crowns or titles. It remembers only care, only touch, only love. And so the peasant's spinach, small, quiet, enduring, ruled a kingdom that no man could ever truly own. The eternal leek. It was early morning when the frost began to retreat. The fields shimmered with thin silver lines where the cold had touched the blades of grass. The sun rose low and golden, brushing warmth across the soil. Where the farmer's perennials lay waiting beneath their blankets of straw, he walked the boundary of his land slowly, as if greeting old friends. Among them, he found one that had outlived them all, a slender green stalk, standing proud against the chill. It was the leek, not just any leek, but the same one that had been there since his father's time. He had never truly replanted it, only divided it, shared it, and let it return. It came back every year, uninvited but always welcome. He liked to think of it as the soul of his garden, patient, steadfast, and quietly eternal. The leek was not a showy plant. Its beauty was in its balance. A smooth white base fading into long, green blades that curved like ribbons. When the wind passed through them, they whispered softly, a sound like the hush of waves against a distant shore in the Middle Ages. Leeks were more than food. They were symbols of protection, endurance, and the cycle of seasons. Soldiers carried them into battle for luck. Monks wove their scent into soups and stews that warmed the spirit as much as the body. Even kings had their stories, wrapped in leek leaves. The farmer knew some of those tales, though not from books. They had been told by firesides, in the pauses between work and rest. His grandfather once said that Saint David of Wales ate nothing but leeks and water during his long fasts. He said that in one great battle, the Welsh soldiers wore leeks in their caps to know friend from foe, and they won. Since then, the leek had been their emblem of courage. But here, in this quiet valley far from any war, courage looked different. It wasn't about swords or banners. It was about tending the same soil year after year, knowing that harvests could fail, but faith could not. The leek had taught him that each spring he would cut away a few of the stalks, leaving the roots behind. From those roots, new shoots would rise, green and clean and full of life. They didn't demand rich soil or constant care. They simply asked to be left in peace, to be given time. He often thought how strange it was that something so small could last so long. While kings came and went, while wars burned across lands he would never see, his leeks kept growing, quietly, endlessly. They didn't care for borders or years. Their rhythm was older than history. His wife used them in nearly every meal, chopped into thin rings for soup, baked into pies, boiled with barley, or stewed with herbs and salt. Their scent filled the cottage daily, warm, earthy, familiar to their children. It was the smell of home in winter, when most crops vanished beneath the frost. The leeks still stood green and strong. Their roots reached deep enough to find warmth in the frozen ground when all else slept. They remained awake, watchful sentinels of the soil. The farmer often said that if all plants had souls, then the leeks was the oldest. He tended them the same way his ancestors had, not through books or science, but through habit and quiet respect. Sometimes, while working the rows, he would kneel beside one and touch the white stalk lightly, brushing away a bit of dirt as if greeting an old friend. "You've seen more winters than I have," he'd murmur, "and you'll see more yet." The neighboring fields had changed hands many times. New owners, new crops, new failures. But his small garden stayed constant, anchored by the same green line of leeks. People laughed, saying he could grow them in stone. He only smiled and said, "They like the company." Once, a traveling herbalist stopped by the village. She carried a basket full of roots and seeds and strange powders from the south. When she saw the farmer's leeks, she knelt and examined them carefully. "These are old," she said softly. "Older than this village, I'd wager." She pulled one from the earth and studied its roots. "Perennial strain, rare these days. You could plant this once and feed a family for decades." The farmer nodded. "That's what we do," he said simply. She smiled. "In my land, we call it the eternal leek." He liked that it fit. She told him stories as they shared a bowl of soup. Stories of ancient Egyptians who believed leeks were blessed by the gods, of Roman generals who fed them to their soldiers for strength, of monks who used their juice to heal wounds. Every culture, it seemed, had known the leek's secret. That endurance, not beauty, was the truest kind of power. After she left, he planted more, not because he needed them, but because he liked the idea of their quiet persistence spreading across the land. He dug small holes near the fence, beside the path, even near the river bank. Each spot received a single young leek, pressed gently into the soil like a blessing. By autumn, they were everywhere, small green markers of time's passing. When the wind blew across the field, they bent in the same direction, a silent congregation of steadfast souls. One night, a storm came, fierce and sudden. The rain lashed against the roof, and thunder rolled through the valley like drums of war. The farmer lay awake, listening to the chaos. He thought of his leeks outside, their long blades shivering in the dark. When morning came, the world was quiet again. He stepped into the field, half expecting ruin. But there they were, standing, wet, but unbroken. The leeks glistened with raindrops, straight and proud, as if the storm had never come. He knelt beside them, smiling. "You never fall, do you?" He whispered. Through years of famine, frost, and plague, the leeks endured. When wheat failed, when barley rotted, when neighbors fled their lands, his small green rows remained. He shared them freely, a handful here, a bundle there. No one left his door hungry. Over time, people began to speak of his garden as something blessed, not for its beauty or size, but for its constancy. They said his soil was different. He always shook his head and said, "No, it's the leeks. They remember how to live." As his hair turned gray and his hands grew slower, the leeks continued their quiet work. They had outlived his youth, his parents, even the wars that swept through nearby lands. And still, they stood. When his son took over the farm, the old man gave one piece of advice. "Don't ever pull them all," he said. "Always leave one to teach the next." His son nodded, though he didn't yet understand. Years later, when the father was gone and the fields were his, the son would find himself kneeling in the same place, brushing the soil from a single white stalk and whispering the same words. "You've seen more winters than I have, and you'll see more yet." The eternal leek had done what it always did, survived, remembered, and taught. It became a quiet inheritance passed not through books or gold, but through roots and patience. Centuries later, when historians would study medieval crops and marvel at their endurance, they would find the same leeks still growing in old monastery gardens, in the corners of forgotten farms, and along the edges of ruined castles. Their DNA would tell a story that no parchment ever could, a story of endurance, humility, and quiet faith. In the end, the eternal leek was never just a vegetable. It was a lesson that what grows slowly lasts, that what needs little gives much, and that true immortality does not belong to kings or monuments, but to those who endure quietly, year after year, root after root. As twilight settled over the valley, the farmer's son stood by the field, the scent of damp soil and green leaves heavy in the air. He looked out at the long rows swaying gently in the evening breeze. Somewhere beyond them, the sound of bells drifted from the monastery, slow, distant, eternal. He smiled and whispered softly, "Sleep well, old friends. Spring will wake you soon." Monastic wisdom. The monastery bell rang before dawn. Its tone rolled across the valley, soft but steady, calling the brothers from their narrow wooden cells. The air was still cold, and mist hung low over the fields, blurring the edges of the world. Somewhere within that silver haze, the monastery garden waited, breathing, patient. Eternal. Brother Anselm was always the first to rise. He tied his worn robe, lit a small lantern, and stepped into the courtyard. The stones beneath his feet were slick with dew. Each morning, He whispered a quiet prayer not just for the souls of men, but for the health of the soil. For to the monks, the garden was not a place of labor. It was a sacred text. Every leaf, every root, every drop of dew was a line written by the hand of God, and Brother Anselm, who had never learned Latin well, found that he understood this language of the earth far better. He walked past rows of herbs still asleep beneath the mist. Lovage, good King Henry, and leeks, the old plants that never died, only rested. He bent to touch them gently, his fingers tracing the damp blades. They had been planted long before he arrived, by hands now gone to dust. Yet the plants remained, their roots deep in the monastery's memory. The monks had a saying, books fade, stone cracks, but a garden remembers. Anselm often repeated it to himself when he felt doubt, when the walls of the scriptorium closed, or when the world beyond seemed too loud, too cruel. The garden, he believed, was the truest scripture that taught humility through failure, patience through seasons, and faith through the smallest green shoot pushing up from dark soil. Every morning after the first prayers, a small group of monks made their way to the herbarium, the medicinal garden that kept the monastery alive through plague and famine. Each plant had a purpose, though few beyond these walls understood them. Lovage for the heart, fennel for the eyes, comfrey for wounds, leeks for strength, and the good King Henry, the poor man's spinach, for nourishment when meat was scarce. Brother Matthew, the apothecary, kept detailed notes of every leaf and root. He was a small man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that sparkled with quiet obsession. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was about the secret life of plants, how some healed the body while others calmed the mind. He claimed that the oldest herbs could listen, that when one prayed while planting, the plant grew differently, gentler, fuller, more forgiving. Some of the younger monks laughed at him, but not Anselm. He believed it. The monastery itself was ancient, its walls built upon Roman stones. Its history was tangled like the roots of the plants it sheltered. When war had swept through the countryside, the fields around were burned, the villages emptied, but the monastery stood untouched, a small island of green amidst the gray. Travelers sometimes arrived at the gates seeking shelter, starving peasants, wounded soldiers, lost merchants. They were all given soup made from the garden's produce. It was simple food, but those who ate it said it felt like medicine. Perhaps it was a mix of herbs known only to the brothers. Or perhaps it was the calm that came from eating food grown in peace. In one corner of the garden grew a patch of mysterious plants, low, with small white flowers and a scent both sharp and sweet. Only Brother Matthew tended that patch, and even Anselm did not know all its secrets. When asked, Matthew would only smile and say, "These are prayers that grow leaves." It was said that their roots could draw out poison, that their petals could heal fever, that their seeds, when ground into powder, could still the mind enough for deep prayer at sunset. When the garden was bathed in gold, Anselm often sat on the old stone bench near the well. The air would be full of bees and birdsong, and the faint hum of the monks chanting in the chapel beyond the garden wall. The sound drifted through the leaves like wind through reeds. He would close his eyes and listen, not to the words, but to the rhythm. He thought of how everything here worked in harmony. The prayers, the soil, the plants, the hands that cared for them, each one a verse in a single, endless hymn. Sometimes he wondered how many generations of monks had tended these same beds. How many had knelt in the same spot, brushed the same soil, felt the same peace that gave him comfort to know that when he was gone, others would come after him, their robes brushing the same pots, their voices rising at dawn. they, too, would touch the lovage and the leeks and whisper small blessings into the earth. At the far edge of the garden stood an apple tree, gnarled and crooked with age. It bore fruit only every few years, but the monks never cut it down. Brother Matthew said its roots were bound to an old grave, perhaps of the first gardener, so they tended it as a relic. Its blossoms, when they came, filled the garden with a scent like old honey and rain. The monks called it the tree of patience. One evening, a young novice named Peter came to Anselm with a question. "Brother," he said, "why do we spend so much time here when there is so much work to do in the world? Shouldn't we be helping people beyond these walls?" Anselm smiled, brushing dirt from his hands. "We are," he said. He pointed to the rows of herbs swaying in the wind. "Every leaf here is a sermon. Every seed, a prayer. When the sick come, we heal them with what grows here. When the hungry come, we feed them. When the weary come, we let them rest in this peace." Peter frowned slightly. "But isn't it slow work?" Anselm nodded. "Yes, all holy work is slow." That night, the young monk thought long about those words. And in the morning, when he joined the others in the garden, he began to understand. He saw how Brother Matthew examined each leaf as though reading scripture. How Brother Anselm watered the beds not hurriedly, but reverently. How even the act of pulling a weed was done with quiet gratitude. The monastery garden, he realized, was not a place of escape. It was a place of service, a living prayer written in roots and sunlight. Years passed. The seasons turned as they always did. The monks grew older. Some passed away, but the garden remained unchanged, green, calm, eternal. When Brother Matthew's eyesight failed, he passed his notes to Peter, now grown and wise. "Remember," he said with a trembling smile, "plants know things we forget." Peter took his words to heart. He began to mix old knowledge with new understanding, recording every healing recipe, every seed that survived frost, every plant that bloomed twice in a year. He discovered that many of the monastery's herbs were perennials, living decades without replanting. He realized the garden's endurance was not a miracle, but a design, nature's quiet promise of renewal in time. Peter became the keeper of the garden. He rose before dawn, tended the same rows, whispered the same blessings. The bell still rang through the valley. The mist still hugged the earth. The world beyond changed. Kings rose and fell. Wars burned and faded. But within the monastery walls, peace remained rooted. When travelers came now, they found a garden richer than before. Its paths glowed with moss. Its borders bloomed with lavender and thyme, and the air hummed softly with bees. They called it God's acre, not for its size, but for its peace. Some said that even the soil there felt different, warmer, kinder, alive. And those who left often carried a small pouch of seeds, given freely by the monks. "Plant these," they would say, "and you'll carry our peace with you." Centuries later, when historians uncovered records from old monasteries, they found mention of gardens that survived without replanting for hundreds of years. Living tapestries of perennial wisdom, and though the names of the monks were long forgotten, their hands still lived in every root that reached for the sun. The monastic gardens were not built for beauty. They were built for balance, between earth and heaven, work and prayer, life and rest. And perhaps that was the greatest wisdom they ever grew. As dusk settled over the valley once more, the bells rang again. The monks gathered for evening prayer, their voices low and steady, rising like smoke into the cooling air beyond the chapel walls. The plants listened, still, breathing, ancient, as if whispering back their own soft hymn. a hymn of patience, a hymn of endurance, a hymn of monastic wisdom. A garden that never slept. The sun had not yet risen, but the garden was already awake. Mist clung low to the earth, curling around the soft green stems of herbs, vegetables, and perennial crops. Every blade of grass, every leaf of lovage and good King Henry glistened with dew, catching the faint light of distant stars. Brother Peter, now older and wise with years of tending, walked the narrow stone paths with bare feet. He moved slowly, aware that in this garden nothing rushed, and yet everything lived, fully, endlessly, tirelessly. The garden never truly slept. Even in the darkest hours of night, the soil breathed. Roots stretched beneath the surface, reaching for water and nutrients. Unseen but persistent, leaves swayed gently in the quiet breeze, making a soft susurration. The forest of herbs whispering stories older than any monastery wall. He knelt beside the lovage, brushing the damp soil away from its roots. Its stalks, tall and proud, bent only slightly to greet him. He inhaled the fragrance, an aroma that carried warmth, memory, and something almost sacred. Nearby, the good King Henry rose from shadowed soil, dark and vibrant. Its leaves, though smaller than the lovage, held a quiet determination, a humble strength. Even under moonlight, it seemed to pulse with life, a reminder that endurance is often quiet, never boastful. The leeks, too, stretched from their beds, straight and tall. Their white bases gleamed faintly in the dim light, a contrast to the green above. Anselm's great-grandfather had once told him that the leek was a symbol of vigilance, and in this stillness, Peter understood why Dad watched the soil as faithfully as a sentinel watches the gate. Every plant had its rhythm. Some opened petals in dawn, others waited until the warmth of noon. Some slept briefly under frost, only to awaken in the soft evening glow. Yet the garden, as a whole, never truly paused. It breathed in cycles of life, a quiet symphony that transcended time. Peter moved along the paths, passing the medicinal patch that Brother Matthew had tended decades earlier. The herbs here were subtle: chamomile, sage, thyme, and a small flowering vine whose name had been forgotten. Even in winter, they clung to life, their roots reaching deeper than most realized. In the distance, the monastery chimed with early morning bells. The sound was soft through the mist but clear, threading through the leaves and branches. It was a reminder that life was a blend of human rhythm and nature's eternal pulse. The monks would soon rise, their prayers joining the garden's whispered symphony. A small stream ran along the edge of the garden, its water clear and cool. It sang a gentle song, tumbling over smooth stones, feeding the roots and moss alike. Dragonflies hovered above, their iridescent wings catching the light like fleeting stars. Insects hummed softly among the flowers, carrying pollen to waiting blooms. Peter knelt beside the stream, filling a clay pitcher with water. He carried it along the paths, gently drizzling it at the base of the lovage, leeks, and other perennials. Even in a garden that never slept, care mattered. The plants required touch, respect, and attention. Though not demands, the monastery kitchen had already begun to stir. Smoke drifted faintly from the hearth, carrying the scent of barley porridge and fresh bread. The gardeners and cooks worked in parallel, tending plants and preparing meals, a living dance of continuity and sustenance. Every harvest, small though it might be, sustained more than the body. It nurtured the soul. Overhead, birds began to call, finches, robins, and a lone nightingale whose song floated across the dew-laden leaves. Peter paused to listen, letting the music mingle with the garden's whispers. It reminded him of the delicate balance that sustained life here. Nothing was forced. Nothing hurried. Everything lived in harmony. He thought about travelers who occasionally arrived at the monastery gates. They often marveled at the garden's abundance, asking how it could flourish so persistently. The answer was simple: time, patience, and respect. The plants were not hurried. They were observed, understood, and allowed to thrive in their own rhythm. Even in stormy weather, the garden endured. Rain battered leaves, and wind swayed the taller stalks. But deep roots anchored everything. Peter remembered one autumn storm that had left the fields battered and mud-soaked. By the next morning, the leeks and lovage had stood tall again, bending only enough to shed the weight of water. Such resilience was a lesson in quiet endurance. He wandered to the far corner of the garden, where small stone markers hinted at graves, the resting places of monks from centuries past. Here, the garden grew differently, wilder, freer. Plants stretched and tangled, embracing each other in a tapestry of life. Peter realized that even death could not halt the pulse of this eternal green. The night before, he had dreamt of the garden at its largest, an endless sea of green, stretching across valleys and hills, illuminated by gentle moonlight. In his dream, he walked among the plants and felt their history. Centuries of sunlight, rain, care, and faith. It was a living library, each leaf a page, each root a sentence. He awoke with a sense of awe, carrying that calm into the new day. By mid-morning, the sun began to pierce the mist, scattering silver and gold across the leaves. The dew sparkled, glinting like tiny gems. Insects stirred more vigorously, and the birds sang louder. Even the stones of the path seemed to warm with life. Peter paused to rest beneath the gnarled apple tree, the oldest living witness in the garden. Its bark was rough beneath his fingers, its branches twisted and heavy with history. He closed his eyes and listened. The rustle of leaves, the babble of the stream, the distant chapel bells, all spoke a single message. Life, when tended with care, never truly ceases. He rose and continued his walk, tracing the paths of his predecessors. The knowledge of centuries lingered in the soil and air, a quiet inheritance of devotion and patience. Every plant he touched carried not just its own life, but the legacy of those who had planted it, tended it, and revered it. By afternoon, the kitchen prepared meals for the brothers, the staff, and the occasional traveler. The garden supplied everything: leeks for the soups, herbs for flavor, lovage for fragrance and warmth, good King Henry for nutrition. Even the smallest shoots were harvested carefully, leaving the plants strong and ready for the next season. The gardeners worked silently, speaking only in whispers or gestures, understanding that noise was unnecessary here. The garden communicated in rustles, hums, and the quiet tug of roots seeking water. The monks had learned to listen. In the evening, after the sun had dipped low, Peter would sit on the bench near the well. The air was cool, fragrant with the scents of flowers and herbs, alive with the hum of nocturnal insects. The garden pulsed gently under the fading light. Awake and watchful, it never rested. It never paused. It was a garden that never slept. And Peter, gazing over its endless green, felt the same enduring calm that had carried generations before him. A calm born not from solitude, not from silence, but from continuity, from life sustained, nurtured, and remembered through frost and sun, storm and drought. It would endure. The garden's voice was subtle, yet eternal, a whisper in every leaf, a song in every root. And though the world beyond the walls would change, the garden would remain, ceaseless, tireless, unbroken, a living testament to care, patience and the quiet heartbeat of life itself. Rhubarb and the art of waiting in the cool light of early morning. The garden stretched out like a green ocean, the mist curling around stalks and leaves like soft tendrils of smoke. Among the perennials, one plant demanded patience above all others: rhubarb. Its broad leaves rose like sails from thick crimson stalks, standing patiently while the seasons turned above and below. Brother Peter, who had walked these paths since youth, knelt beside the rhubarb patch. He brushed soil gently from the base of each stalk, careful not to disturb the deep, fleshy roots that had taken years to establish. Rhubarb, he thought, was a teacher. Its lessons were slow, subtle, and often invisible to the impatient eye. Unlike the leeks that returned annually without fuss, or the good King Henry that grew with quiet abundance, rhubarb demanded attention. It asked for time, it asked for observation, it asked for restraint. The medieval gardeners understood this. They knew that to harvest too early would weaken the plant, robbing it of energy needed to survive the harsh winters and thrive the following spring. So they waited, marking the passing months not with calendars but with patience, watching the swelling of buds and the elongation of stalks, reading the weather in the angle of sunlight and the dampness of soil. Rhubarb was more than a food. It was a discipline that trained the gardener in the art of restraint, in the wisdom of timing, and in the virtue of listening to the land. Peter remembered an old manuscript he had once discovered in the monastery library. It described rhubarb as the plant that rewards patience. It spoke of the slow spread of roots, the careful preparation of beds, and the ritual of waiting through the frost before the first harvest could begin. The text emphasized that impatience could be fatal. A stalk cut too early would weaken not only the plant but the spirit of the gardener. He smiled at the memory. The wisdom seemed almost poetic. That life, like rhubarb, was strongest when nurtured with care, not rushed. The sun began to rise, scattering gold across the field. The rhubarb leaves caught the light, their green veined with crimson, shimmering like fine silk. Peter gently pressed his hand to the stalks, feeling their cool firmness, their readiness not yet reached. It was a reminder that strength often lay beneath the surface, invisible until the proper moment arrived. The monastery kitchen would not need rhubarb for several more weeks. Yet the gardeners checked the patch daily. They observed the curves of each leaf, the color of the stalk, the firmness of the roots in the soil. It was a quiet ritual, performed not out of obligation but reverence. Even the monks who rarely ventured into the garden came to admire the rhubarb when the sunlight struck it just right. Its presence was a promise that patience bore fruit, and that life sustained itself in cycles far older than any human reckoning. As the morning passed, Peter moved along the rows, tending to other perennials, but always returning his gaze to the rhubarb. It demanded no praise, yet its power was subtle, grounding the garden in rhythm and resilience. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of wet soil, moss, and faint herbal sweetness. Peter inhaled deeply, letting the aroma fill him with calm. He imagined the generations of monks and peasants who had watched this same plant grow, year after year, learning the same lessons of restraint and timing. It struck him that the rhubarb patch was almost like a clock, not of hours or minutes, but of patience, resilience, and the slow unfolding of time itself. One could not hurry it, nor could one ignore it. One simply waited, tended, and watched, knowing that the reward would come in its own moment. In spring, when the first stalks were finally ready, the harvest was a gentle ceremony. Peter knelt beside the thick stalks, slicing each one carefully at the base. The leaves were discarded, for they were bitter and inedible, but the stalks were crisp, sweet tart, and full of the sunlight and rain they had absorbed over weeks of quiet growth. The kitchen transformed them into pies and stews, preserving some for winter and giving some to travelers and neighbors. Each bite was imbued with the patience of the gardener, the steady rhythms of the seasons, and the silent endurance of the plant itself. Even as the harvest ended, the roots remained strong and healthy, ready to sleep through winter before rising again in spring. Peter often knelt and pressed his hands into the soil around them, feeling the slow pulse of life beneath the earth. It reminded him that some of the most important things in life could not be rushed. Growth, wisdom, strength, all needed time. Rhubarb taught more than cooking or nutrition. It taught mindfulness. It taught observation. It taught respect for cycles far larger than human schedules or ambitions. Travelers who came to the monastery were often struck by this lesson. They marveled at the garden's abundance and the care lavished on a plant they had never before considered important. They returned to their own villages, often carrying rhubarb roots or seeds, and with them a quiet understanding that life's sweetest rewards came not from haste, but from thoughtful waiting. By summer, the garden's other crops had grown tall and strong, their leaves brushing the sky. Yet the rhubarb remained central, a testament to the power of patience. Peter walked among the rows in the heat of the day, checking soil moisture, removing weeds, and ensuring the roots were unbroken. The garden moved at its own rhythm, and he followed, learning anew each day the art of waiting. Even in autumn, when frost began to chill the edges of leaves and the air carried the smell of wood smoke, the rhubarb endured. Its leaves withered slightly, and stalks thickened in preparation for the dormant months ahead. Peter would cover the patch with straw and whisper a soft blessing, thanking the plant for its lesson and promising careful tending in the seasons to come. Through generations, this rhythm continued. The monastery kept records of plantings and harvests, noting which beds thrived, which required adjustment, and how each variety responded to the climate. Rhubarb, always slow, always deliberate, stood as a symbol of continuity, a bridge connecting past, present, and future. Even centuries later, when historians would uncover manuscripts and drawings from the monastery, they would marvel at the dedication to a single plant. They would see the careful tending, the cycles of growth and rest, the deep understanding of timing that medieval gardeners had cultivated. And perhaps, in those quiet drawings and notes, they would glimpse the real lesson of rhubarb. That life, like a stalk of this enduring plant, flourishes best when met with patience and care. The garden itself never slept. Its roots slumbered beneath the soil. Its leaves rested at night, yet its essence persisted through frost, rain, heat, and sun, and in that constancy, Peter found peace, the calm assurance that patience, above all else, yielded the most profound rewards. As night fell and the stars appeared, he lingered by the rhubarb patch, listening to the soft hum of nocturnal insects and the gentle rustle of leaves. He understood, in that quiet moment, that the true harvest of life was not measured in food alone. It was measured in wisdom, in restraint, and in the art of waiting. And so, beneath the pale glow of moonlight, the garden remained alive, teaching its patient lesson to all who would pause, watch, and care. The rhubarb stood tall, crimson and green, a sentinel of time and perseverance, and Peter, kneeling beside it, felt the eternal rhythm of the earth, steady, quiet, and endlessly wise. The silent gift of asparagus in the pale light of dawn. The garden breathed softly. Mist hung low, curling like delicate ribbons around the tender shoots of asparagus, tall, spear-like, and slender. They emerged quietly from the soil, as if aware of their own patience and importance. The air smelled of damp earth, fresh herbs, and the faint promise of spring's awakening. Brother Peter, now aged and wise from decades of tending the monastery's garden, walked the path slowly. His eyes rested on the asparagus patch, where new shoots stretched toward the early sunlight. Unlike many crops, asparagus did not demand attention. It did not call for admiration. It offered itself silently, growing steadily, year after year, from the same root system, often for decades without needing replanting. The monks called it the silent gift, a plant that provided nourishment and subtle delight without complaint or extravagance. Peter remembered learning this from Brother Matthew, who had once said, "Some gifts are loud and fleeting. Others, like asparagus, are quiet and enduring. Those are the gifts that teach the deepest lessons." Asparagus had been valued since antiquity, revered in the courts of kings and the tables of monasteries alike. It was a delicacy. Yet in this humble garden, it remained simple, almost meditative. The shoots, emerging from the rich, dark soil, reminded the monks that abundance often arrives unannounced. It rewards those who wait, those who care, and those who recognize the quiet rhythm of nature. Peter knelt beside the patch, brushing loose soil from a tender stalk. Its spears were firm, green fading to purple at the tips, each one a testament to the patient work of roots buried deep beneath the earth. He could almost feel the history in them, the generations of hands that had planted, nurtured, and observed this plant with reverence. In the silence, he imagined the monks of centuries past, kneeling in exactly this spot, whispering prayers as they tended the same rows of asparagus. Unlike annual crops, asparagus demanded patience. The early harvest could weaken the roots, so the monks carefully waited until the third year after planting. Then, they began a slow, disciplined ritual of cutting only what the plant could afford to give. Each stalk harvested was a measured gift, never taken in greed, always in gratitude. The kitchen staff valued asparagus highly. When prepared in soups, stews, or simply boiled with butter, it offered a delicate flavor that seemed almost ethereal. It was not sustenance alone that made it precious. It was the story it carried. Every bite was a connection to centuries of careful cultivation, an unspoken dialogue between the earth and the gardener. Peter remembered one early spring when a wandering herbalist had visited the monastery. He had marveled at the asparagus patch, noting the thickness of the roots and the uniformity of the shoots. Few gardens tend asparagus with such care, the herbalist remarked. He spoke of the plant's endurance, its subtle gifts, and its ability to thrive silently for decades, a living testament to patience and wisdom. As the sun rose, casting golden light across the garden, Peter moved along the rows, checking each plant. He felt a profound sense of calm in this ritual. Every stalk that rose from the soil was a reminder that life could be abundant without noise, that giving need not be loud to be valuable. The asparagus patch was bordered by lovage and leeks, herbs and perennials that all spoke in their own quiet ways. Yet the asparagus had a special dignity. It grew steadily, refusing to rush or bend under the weight of expectation. It reminded the monks that strength and generosity could coexist with humility and silence. In the afternoons, travelers sometimes visited the garden. They admired the abundance, asking how such delicate plants could grow so well. Peter would smile and explain the simple secret: patience, care, and respect for the rhythm of the seasons. Nature rewards those who wait, he would say, gesturing to the slender green spears standing tall in the rich soil. Even in times of scarcity, asparagus endured. While other crops might fail due to frost or drought, The deep roots of asparagus provided a reliable gift year after year. It was food. Yes, but more than that. It was hope that reminded the monks that steady, patient care could sustain life even in challenging times. As the seasons turned, Peter observed the transformation. New shoots appeared in spring, stood firm in summer, and faded gracefully in autumn, leaving the roots to rest through the winter. The cycle repeated endlessly, a silent rhythm that required no human applause, only careful observation and gentle tending in the monastery's refectory. Asparagus became part of communal meals. It nourished bodies and souls alike. The monks spoke little while eating, appreciating the quiet gifts before them. Even the youngest novices learned the lesson that life's most important rewards often arrived slowly, and those who rushed would miss their significance. Peter sometimes wandered to the far edge of the garden, where wild flowers mingled with perennials, and watched the sunset reflect off the asparagus leaves. The play of light and shadow across the tall green stalks felt almost sacred. He reflected on the centuries of care that had made this possible, and the unseen hands that had once tended these same plants. The silent gift extended beyond nourishment. It inspired contemplation. It taught that generosity need not be loud, that strength could be quiet, and that patience yielded fruits unseen by those who hurried through life. Over time, the garden became a place of pilgrimage, not for wealth or glory, but for learning the rhythms of the earth. People came to see the asparagus, to walk among the rows, and to understand the lessons embedded in the patient growth of this humble plant. Even after Peter grew old, he continued to walk among the asparagus beds, hands brushing gently against the stalks, feeling the pulse of life beneath the soil. He knew that when he was gone, others would follow, tending the same patch with care and reverence, harvesting only what could be given without harm, and learning once more the value of silent generosity. The asparagus, steadfast and patient, remained. It rose year after year, a gift that demanded little yet gave much. It reminded every gardener, monk, and visitor that true abundance comes not from haste, but from time, care, and respect for the slow rhythms of nature. As night fell, the garden glowed softly in the moonlight. The asparagus stood tall, unwavering, silent, a living symbol of endurance and quiet giving. Peter lingered, listening to the subtle hum of the earth, the whisper of the wind, and the rustle of leaves. He felt the eternal lesson the plant carried, that life's most precious gifts are often the quietest, waiting patiently to be noticed, nurtured, and cherished. And in that stillness, beneath the stars and mist, he understood fully why asparagus had earned its title, the silent gift of the garden, enduring and unassuming, yet full of life, strength, and wisdom. Perennial peas of the forgotten fields. Morning mist lingered over the monastery gardens, softening the edges of the stone paths and the green, dew-laden leaves of countless perennials. Among these enduring plants, the peas held a special place, humble, unassuming, yet vital to life and sustenance. Brother Peter, now gray-haired with decades of tending the gardens, walked slowly among the rows. He paused at the trellises, watching as pea vines clung to supports with natural persistence, their tendrils curling with quiet determination. Unlike the dramatic bursts of color from flowers or the towering stalks of lovage and leeks, the peas were modest, yet in their modesty, they were resilient. These were perennial peas, plants that returned year after year, spreading roots deep into the soil, replenishing themselves, and providing food without the need for annual replanting. In the forgotten fields beyond the monastery walls, such crops had long been a lifeline for peasants and monks alike. Peter knelt to inspect a cluster of young pods, their pale green hiding tiny seeds inside. He brushed a leaf aside, marveling at the continuity of life it represented. These were the same seeds planted by hands long gone, their descendants now carrying on the quiet legacy of the fields. It was a reminder that even the smallest plants could leave the largest imprint on history. The peas taught lessons beyond sustenance. They taught rhythm and patience. They required careful support as they climbed, a steady watch against pests, and mindful harvesting to avoid damaging future growth. Neglect them, and the yield would falter. Tend them gently, and they would sustain for years, a quiet abundance in a world often marked by scarcity. Peter remembered reading an ancient manuscript in the monastery library, detailing the cultivation of peas in forgotten fields. It described how, when managed with care, perennial peas could survive decades, producing pods year after year. The notes emphasized the importance of spacing, pruning, and observation, the subtle art of watching, understanding, and allowing growth without interference. He ran his fingers along a vine, feeling its tension and strength that it wrapped naturally around the trellis, curling as it sought support. He smiled, appreciating the elegance of its design and the way it mirrored human life, reaching, adapting, and persevering in the monastery kitchen. Peas were a humble but indispensable part of meals, boiled in stews, added to soups, or mashed simply with butter. They provided protein and sustenance. The monks ate them quietly, in contemplation, knowing that each pod carried the labor and care of many seasons. Travelers and pilgrims often marveled at the perennial peas, asking how such delicate plants could endure for so long. Peter explained that it was a combination of patience, attention, and respect for natural cycles. "You cannot rush a pea," he would say. "They will grow in their own time, and when they do, they reward your care with life itself." The field stretched far beyond the monastery walls, over rolling hills and into forgotten meadows. Here, perennial peas thrived with minimal intervention, their roots stabilizing the soil, their pods feeding generations of monks, villagers, and travelers alike. They were silent witnesses to the passage of time, enduring wars, famines, and the relentless march of seasons. Then spring. The shoots pushed through the earth slowly, tentative at first, then stronger as the days lengthened. The monks tied them carefully to trellises, guiding their growth without forcing it. By summer, the vines were full, pods hanging heavy and green, ready for the careful, measured harvest that would sustain them through autumn and winter. Peter paused to observe the interaction between plants. The peas grew among companions, herbs, flowers, and other perennials. They contributed to the ecosystem of the garden, enriching the soil with nitrogen, providing shade for delicate seedlings, and offering shelter to beneficial insects. Everything was interconnected, a quiet symphony of life sustained by careful attention and respect. Sometimes, storms battered the fields, wind tore through leaves, rain flooded pots, and yet the peas persisted. Their deep roots anchored them firmly, their flexibility allowing them to bend rather than break. Peter marveled at their resilience, reflecting on how this mirrored human endurance in a world of uncertainty. By late summer, the harvest began. Peter and his fellow monks moved slowly among the vines, selecting pods with care, leaving enough behind for the plants to continue producing. Each harvest was measured, precise, and mindful, a ritual that emphasized sustainability over immediate gain. Even in autumn, when frost began to touch the edges of leaves, the roots remained alive and strong. The plants receded into dormancy, storing energy for the next spring, a quiet promise of continuity and renewal. Peter covered some of the rows with straw to protect them, whispering blessings for the coming months. the lessons of perennial peas extended beyond the garden. They taught observation, patience, and foresight. They reminded the monks that the rewards of life are often slow to appear, yet enduring once they do, and for those who listened carefully. They offered wisdom. Growth takes time, resilience requires care, and abundance is often quiet. Over the decades, the peas spread, filling forgotten fields beyond the monastery walls. Villagers learned from the monks, planting their own perennial crops, guided by the same principles of patience and observation. The knowledge endured, passed from one generation to the next, like the vines themselves. Quietly, steadily, persistently, by winter, the garden rested, the peas hidden beneath straw and soil. Yet even in dormancy, life persisted, roots held strong, waiting for the warmth of spring to awaken them. The garden was never truly silent. It was alive, breathing, and preparing for the cycle to begin again. Peter often sat on the old stone bench near the pea trellises, reflecting on the cycles of life he had witnessed. He thought of the generations of monks, peasants, and travelers who had tended these fields, each leaving a trace of care and wisdom. And he understood that the true harvest of perennial peas was not measured in pods alone, but in the continuity, knowledge, and patience they inspired. As stars appeared overhead and night descended upon the forgotten fields, Peter lingered, listening to the gentle rustle of the leaves. The peas swayed softly in the wind, resilient and steadfast in their quiet persistence. They carried the legacy of centuries, a living reminder that life's most enduring gifts are often humble, patient, and persistent. And so, in the calm hush of evening, the perennial peas of the forgotten field stood tall and unwavering, offering sustenance, wisdom, and quiet inspiration to all who tended them. Roots that remember eat in the gray light of dawn, the garden lay shrouded in mist, each leaf and stalk shimmering with tiny beads of dew. Peter walked slowly along the familiar stone paths, his eyes drawn downward to the earth beneath the vibrant shoots and sprawling leaves. The roots held silent stories older than any human memory. Some roots penetrated deep into the soil, twisting through layers of centuries, carrying with them a record of seasons past. They had seen sun and rain, frost and storm, war and famine. Yet they endured, feeding the plants above, anchoring the garden, and preserving the legacy of those who had come before. Peter knelt to examine a particularly thick root of good King Henry. He traced its ridges with his fingers, imagining the hands of medieval gardeners who had first planted it in this very spot. He could almost feel their presence, their hopes and care still embedded in the soil. The monastery had always treated its gardens as living archives. Every plant, every root was a repository of knowledge, of what had thrived, what had survived hardship, and what had nourished countless generations, even in silence. The roots remembered lovage, leeks, asparagus, and perennial peas. Each carried stories in their underground tendrils. Peter reflected that while the world above ground changed, buildings erected, paths widened, new generations of monks arrived, the roots remained. They remembered sun and rain, drought and abundance, the rhythm of life that persisted quietly beneath the surface. He moved to the leeks, whose white stalks rose proudly from the soil. Beneath them, the roots reached deep, intertwining with their neighbors, forming a network of shared sustenance and resilience. Peter imagined the roots whispering to one another, exchanging information about soil conditions, moisture, and nutrients, a hidden dialogue, invisible to human eyes. The monastery library contained manuscripts describing how medieval gardeners had observed root systems. With meticulous care, they noted how deep roots allowed plants to survive harsh winters, how they could draw water and nourishment from unexpected depths, and how careful cultivation of roots ensured perennial harvests. These were practices born of observation, patience, and a profound respect for the life that unfolded beneath the surface. Peter reflected on the symbolism of roots. Just as they anchored plants and supplied them with sustenance, they anchored memory and history. Beneath every footstep in the garden lay layers of the past, preserved invisibly, silently, like an underground archive of life itself. Even after decades of cultivation, the roots continued to grow and spread, adapting to changes in the soil and climate. Some roots were old enough to have witnessed storms that no living monk remembered, and yet they thrived, steadfast and persistent. They were both fragile and mighty, delicate in their extension, yet resilient in their endurance. Peter walked slowly to the far corner of the garden, where a particularly venerable apple tree stood. Its roots had burrowed for decades, perhaps centuries, beneath the earth, surviving droughts, storms, and the tread of countless footsteps. He pressed his hand to the soil at its base, feeling the subtle pulse of life. Here, in this quiet corner, he understood that the roots did more than sustain life above. They preserved memory, history, and continuity. The perennial crops in this garden were all like that, repositories of time. Their roots told the story of seasons, of harvests, of patient care, and of lives lived in harmony with the land. They were silent teachers, reminding those who tended them of the passage of years, the endurance of life, and the lessons of patience. Even the smallest roots carried significance. Peter knelt beside a young rhubarb plant, tracing the slender tendrils beneath the soil. Though the shoot above ground was small, the root carried energy, memory, and potential. It was a promise that life would continue, that the lessons of the past were preserved, and that the harvest of tomorrow would be secured. As he moved among the rows of leeks, peas, and lovage, he reflected on the interconnectedness of all roots. Some reached out to neighboring plants, exchanging subtle nutrients and moisture. Some branched deeply, drawing from layers of soil untouched for decades. Together, they formed a network that was stronger than any single plant, a web of life that connected generations past, present, and future. The monks often spoke of the roots as if they were sentient. While Peter understood they did not think or speak in human terms, he knew that in their endurance, adaptation, and persistence, they conveyed wisdom. They reminded him of the importance of grounding, patience, and observation, of understanding life that exists below the surface, hidden from immediate view. Even during harsh winters, when the garden appeared barren, the roots remained alive, storing energy and preparing for spring. The surface may have slept, but beneath, life persisted quietly, steadily, faithfully. Peter often marveled at this, considering how much the visible world relied upon unseen foundations. He recalled an old teaching, that the strength of life is often invisible, just as human wisdom, experience, and memory are preserved in subtle ways. So too are the lessons of the garden embedded underground. The roots remembered what the eyes could not see, sustaining life and preparing it for the challenges ahead. As the sun rose higher, casting light across the garden, Peter continued his careful walk among the crops. He brushed soil from the bases of leeks and lovage, checked the vigor of the peas, and admired the stubborn growth of asparagus. All the while, he felt the pulse of roots beneath his hands, the invisible threads that carried life forward. He paused near the lovage, placing his palms gently on the earth. The roots there were thick and strong, a testament to decades of care and cultivation. They had weathered storms, endured drought, and persisted through generations of gardeners, and in their endurance, they carried the memory of all who had worked this soil before him. Peter thought about how each plant's root was unique, some shallow, some deep, some spreading wide, others growing straight and true. Yet together, they formed a tapestry of life, a hidden network that connected past and future, sustaining both the garden and the people who depended upon it. By mid-morning, the gardeners and monks began their work above ground, harvesting leaves and shoots carefully, ensuring that the roots remained intact. Each plant offered sustenance, beauty, and wisdom, but it was the roots that ensured continuity. Without them, the garden would not endure. With them, it became a living archive of life itself. Peter moved to the far end of the garden, where an ancient rhubarb root had endured for decades. Its stalks had long since withered in winter. Yet below the soil, the root stored energy, memories of seasons past, and potential for countless future harvests. He knelt, pressing his fingers gently against it, feeling the life pulsing silently beneath his touch. Even travelers who passed through the monastery remarked on the vitality of the gardens. They admired the lushness of the plants above ground, but Peter knew that the true story lay beneath, in the roots that remembered, sustained, and quietly taught the art of patience and endurance. As evening fell, the garden glowed softly in the waning sunlight. Peter lingered among the rows, feeling the calm presence of life below, the invisible threads that connected centuries of growth. He understood fully that the roots carried more than nutrients. They carried memory, history, and wisdom, quietly shaping the world above ground. And as night descended, the garden settled into its timeless rhythm. Above, leaves swayed gently in the breeze. Below, roots remembered everything: the sun, the rain, the care of hands long gone in their endurance. They offered a lesson to all who walked the garden paths, that the unseen often sustains life, and that memory, like roots, endures quietly, faithfully, and eternally. The alchemy of compost morning air carried the rich, earthy scent of decomposing leaves and soil. Peter walked slowly along the garden paths, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the neat rows of vegetables, herbs, and perennials. He paused near the compost heap, a mound of leaves, vegetable peelings, and other organic matter that would, in time, transform into dark, fertile soil. The monks called it alchemy, and rightly so. Here, the remnants of one season's life, wilted leaves, spent plants, peelings from the kitchen, were reborn into nourishment for the next. It was a quiet, patient transformation, one that demanded observation and care rather than force. Peter knelt beside the heap, brushing his fingers through the rich, dark material. It was warm beneath his touch, alive with tiny organisms unseen by the eye. Earthworms wriggled, bacteria decomposed, and fungi intertwined, all participating in the slow magic of conversion from decay to fertility. That this was life in motion, a reminder that even endings could be beginnings. In medieval gardens, compost was more than waste management. It was a crucial component of the agricultural cycle. The soil, replenished with the nutrients of composted matter, ensured perennial crops like leeks, lovage, and asparagus could thrive year after year. Without it, the gardens would fade, their bounty diminished. Compost was, in essence, the secret behind longevity. Peter remembered an old manuscript detailing the art of composting. It emphasized timing, knowing when leaves were ready, which kitchen scraps could be added, and how to layer materials to balance moisture and decay. It spoke of turning the pile carefully, watching the temperature, and observing the subtle shifts in texture and aroma, all signs of the transformative process taking place. He ran his hands through the heap, feeling the warmth of life teeming within. It was almost meditative, each handful a lesson in patience, in watching, in allowing nature to take its course. The monks understood that forcing the process could spoil it. It needed time, observation, and respect. The compost, Peter knew, was a teacher as much as it was nourishment. It taught that decay was not loss, but transformation. That patience produced abundance. That careful attention, even to what seems worthless, could yield great rewards. Around him, the garden thrived thanks to this unseen labor. Lovage, leeks, rhubarb, asparagus, all drew strength from the nutrients released by compost. Even the soil itself seemed enriched with a kind of wisdom, carrying the history of past plants and past seasons within its dark, fertile depths. Peter often reflected on the cyclic nature of compost. What had once nourished life now returned to it, creating a continuity that mirrored the cycles of the seasons, the year, and life itself. It was a quiet form of immortality, where the past lived on in the roots, stems, and leaves of future generations of plants. The process was slow, often taking months for matter to fully decompose and become usable soil. The monks observed it with reverence, recognizing that the speed of human life was not always aligned with nature's rhythm. Through compost, they learned patience, humility, and a profound respect for the slow, unseen work that sustains life in the kitchen. The impact of compost was subtle yet tangible. Greens were more vibrant, roots were stronger, and herbs offered richer fragrance and flavor. Meals were nourished, not just in body but in spirit, sustained by a quiet, persistent magic that began in the humble piles of decomposing matter. Peter smiled as he walked among the rows of thriving plants, tracing their roots and leaves. All of this, the bounty, the health, the longevity of the garden, owed itself to the unseen labor of compost. It was a lesson that what appears unremarkable can be extraordinary in its consequences. Even the smallest scraps mattered. A peel of a carrot, wilted cabbage leaves, fallen petals, all contributed to the cycle of life in the garden. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a purpose. In this, the monks saw a reflection of life itself, careful stewardship, gratitude, and attention to the details that often go unnoticed. Peter remembered a summer when a particularly dry season had left much of the garden thirsty and tired of the compost. However, retained moisture and nutrients, feeding deep roots and keeping the perennials alive and resilient. It was an invisible guardian, silently sustaining life through hardship. The process of creating compost was almost ceremonial. Leaves were layered with straw and vegetable waste. Small amounts of ash from the kitchen hearth were added, and water was sprinkled to maintain balance. Each layer was deliberate, each addition meaningful, and as the pile matured, heat rose from within, a tangible sign of transformation taking place beneath the surface. Peter often ran his fingers through the heap, marveling at the interconnectedness of life. The decay of one thing became the nourishment of another. It was a humbling lesson. Life was not linear, nor was it solitary. Everything was connected, feeding, sustaining, and depending upon what came before. As he worked, he imagined the generations of monks who had tended these gardens before him. They, too, had built compost heaps, watched over them, and learned from them. Their knowledge, embedded in the soil, and in the practices passed down, ensured that the garden would continue to thrive long after any individual gardener had gone. By evening, the compost heap had cooled, releasing gentle warmth back into the soil. Peter brushed his hands clean and walked among the thriving rows of perennials. He felt a profound sense of calm and satisfaction, knowing that the work of tending, nurturing, and observing had produced not just nourishment but continuity, knowledge, and life itself. Even the next generation of monks would benefit from this unseen magic. They would dig into the soil, plant seeds, and find a richness that seemed almost miraculous. And if they paused and observed carefully, they would understand the lesson that Peter had learned so many decades before. That decay, patience, and care are the alchemy of life. Night fell softly over the monastery garden. Stars appeared overhead, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves of lovage, leeks, and asparagus. The compost, hidden beneath the surface, continued its work, slowly transforming the remnants of the past into nourishment for the future. It was the heartbeat of the garden, steady, silent, and eternal. Peter lingered at the edge of the heap, watching the moonlight catch the green shoots above. He thought about the centuries of gardens that had come before, the generations of hands that had added to the pile, and the cycles of growth that would continue long after he was gone. The alchemy of compost, he realized, was not just about plants, it was about life, memory, and the quiet, enduring power of patience and care. And as he walked back along the garden paths, leaving the compost to its silent work, he understood fully why the monks had called it alchemy, because it turned endings into beginnings, waste into life, and quiet labor into eternal abundance. The women who tended forever the garden awoke slowly in the pale light of dawn, dew glistening on the leaves of leeks, rhubarb, and lovage. Peter walked the familiar stone paths, but today his attention lingered on the hands that had nurtured these plants long before him. The hands of women whose names were often unrecorded, yet whose labor endured through centuries in medieval monasteries and villages. Women were often the true stewards of the garden. They planted, weeded, watered, and harvested with a rhythm attuned to the seasons and the needs of the perennials. They understood the subtle language of plants, the tilt of a leaf, the firmness of a stalk, the way a vine wrapped around a trellis. Peter paused beside the rhubarb patch, brushing his fingers along the soil. It had been tended carefully for decades. Roots deep and strong. He imagined the women who had cared for it, kneeling in the earth, hands damp and worn, eyes focused on the slow, patient growth of each stalk. The work was quiet, almost invisible, yet it was essential. Without their dedication, the perennials would not have survived, nor would the garden have thrived for centuries. Their labor was a form of continuity, a bridge between generations, preserving not just plants but the knowledge and patience required to sustain them. In small villages, women managed kitchen gardens, ensuring their families had vegetables and herbs year-round. They knew which crops could be left to grow perennially, which needed careful rotation, and which required special care to endure harsh winters. Their knowledge was both practical and intuitive, passed from mother to daughter, often unrecorded but deeply embedded in daily life. Peter knelt to inspect a patch of good King Henry. Its broad leaves rose proudly, vibrant and healthy. He traced the ridges of the stalks, imagining the hands that had guided its growth for decades. These women had worked silently, their efforts unnoticed by most, yet they had shaped the garden's enduring bounty. The monastery records occasionally mentioned women's contributions, tending the infirmary garden, preparing herbal remedies, or assisting in food preparation. Yet much of their work was invisible, like the roots beneath the soil, sustaining life without recognition. Peter often thought of them as quiet architects of continuity, their patience and skill woven into every row, every bed, and every perennial that returned year after year. He remembered Sister Agnes, a woman who had once tended the monastery gardens with remarkable dedication. She moved through the rows with careful hands and a calm presence, speaking softly to the plants as though they could understand her words. She knew the rhythm of each perennial, the timing of harvests, and the subtle signs that indicated health or distress. Sister Agnes had taught Peter much about observation and patience. She would say, "A garden is not just a place for food. It is a place to learn patience, to see the slow unfolding of life, and to honor the hands that nurture it." In the warm light of spring, the garden was a tapestry of green, punctuated by the colors of herbs, flowers, and vegetables. The women's hands had shaped each bed, pruned each plant, and ensured that the perennials would continue to give their gifts for generations to come. Even after Sister Agnes passed, her lessons remained in the soil, the roots, and the careful arrangement of each plant. Peter walked to the asparagus patch, admiring the tall, slender spears. These, too, had been tended carefully, year after year, by women who understood the art of measured harvesting, taking only what could be spared, leaving enough for the plant to grow and thrive in the coming years. The work of tending perennials required foresight, patience, and attention to detail. It was not hurried work. It could not be rushed, and yet it offered profound satisfaction, as the plants rewarded careful care with steady growth, resilience, and abundance. In villages, women also managed seed selection, ensuring the next generation of plants would thrive. They saved seeds from the healthiest crops, noting which plants produced the best flavor, the strongest roots, or the most abundant leaves. This knowledge, handed down through generations, was essential to sustaining the garden over decades, even centuries. Peter often thought about the continuity of this labor, how one generation of women nurtured the garden, and another inherited it, building upon the knowledge and care of those who came before. It was a form of immortality, not through monuments or written records, but through living plants that returned year after year, even in the harsh winters. When the garden appeared dormant, the women's care was evident. Beds were mulched, roots protected, and compost applied with precision, ensuring that life persisted beneath the surface. Their work created the conditions for renewal, a quiet assurance that the garden would awaken with vigor in spring. Peter paused by a bed of rhubarb, brushing soil from the leaves. He imagined the women who had kneaded the earth, arranged the beds, and whispered to the plants. Their labor was not just physical but spiritual, an investment of care, observation, and understanding that ensured the perennials would flourish. The garden was also a place of learning. Young novices watched and assisted, absorbing the knowledge of women who had tended for decades. Through observation and practice, they learned patience, precision, and respect for life's slow rhythms. In this way, the wisdom of the women who tended forever was preserved, not in manuscripts, but in skill, habit, and memory. Peter reflected on the symbolic power of this labor. The women's work was invisible yet foundational. Like roots beneath the soil, it reminded him that much of what sustains life, society, and continuity happens quietly, without recognition, but with profound impact. As the morning sun rose higher, Peter moved through the garden, observing the lushness of the perennials. Every thriving plant was a testament to centuries of care, patience, and attention, and woven into that legacy were the hands of women, steady, observant, and enduring, whose labor ensured that the garden could indeed be planted once and harvested for generations. Even the youngest apprentices could sense the presence of these past gardeners. They felt it in the soil, the arrangement of the beds, and the vitality of the plants. It was a silent inheritance, a living memory of dedication and continuity. By evening, the garden settled into a quiet calm, the air heavy with the scent of earth, herbs, and growing things. Peter lingered among the rows, feeling the enduring presence of those who had tended before him. He understood fully that their labor had shaped not just the garden, but the rhythm of life itself, teaching lessons of patience, care, and devotion that could not be rushed. And as night descended, the moon casting soft light over the lush beds of leeks, lovage, rhubarb, and asparagus, Peter whispered a silent thanks to the women who had tended forever. Their hands, their care, and their patience lived on in every leaf, stalk, and root, a legacy as enduring as the perennials themselves. The song of the seasons, the first light of spring filtered softly through the mist, touching the dew-laden leaves of leeks, lovage, and rhubarb. Peter walked slowly along the garden paths, listening to the subtle sounds that marked the turning of the seasons. Birds calling from distant trees, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the faint trickle of water from the stone fountain near the monastery wall. The garden was a living calendar, its plants and perennials announcing the passage of time. Every sprout, every bloom, and every tender shoot followed the rhythm of the seasons, a song that played quietly, unnoticed by many, yet guiding the lives of those who listened. Peter paused by the asparagus patch, noting the tender green spears rising from the soil. Spring had arrived, and with it came the first harvest of the year. The perennials, planted once long ago, responded to the changing light and temperature, their growth a quiet testimony to the cycles of nature. The seasons dictated the work of the gardeners. In early spring, the soil was prepared, compost applied, and delicate shoots carefully tended. Summer brought growth, abundance, and careful observation. Autumn demanded measured harvesting and protection for the roots that would endure winter. And winter, though quiet and still, was a time of rest, reflection, and preparation for the year to come. Peter knelt to examine a patch of perennial peas, tracing their slender tendrils as they climbed the trellises. He imagined the centuries of growth, the countless springs and summers that had come before, each season shaping the plants and preparing them for the next. It was a song without words, a rhythm understood by those who cared deeply for the land. The monks often spoke of the garden as a teacher. Through observation, they learned patience, resilience, and the importance of timing. Planting to early risked frost, harvesting to late risked spoil. By attuning themselves to the song of the seasons, they harmonized their work with the natural rhythm of life. Peter remembered one spring when an unusually warm March had caused early growth in the asparagus. The monks were cautious, restraining their excitement, knowing that patience would yield a better harvest later. And indeed, when the proper season arrived, the spears were tender and abundant, a quiet reward for their careful observation and restraint. The Song of the Seasons was not only a guide for planting and harvesting, but also a teacher of humility. It reminded humans that they were part of a larger cycle, not its master. The garden thrived when tended with respect and understanding, faltering when rushed or ignored, even in the harshest winters. When snow blanketed the garden and frost stiffened the leaves, the perennials endured. Beneath the frozen surface, roots stored energy, quietly waiting for spring's warmth. Peter would walk among the covered beds, feeling the rhythm beneath his feet, the slow, steady pulse of life that would awaken when the season turned. The monks marked the passage of time by observing these changes. They recorded first blooms, last harvests, and the subtle shifts in growth patterns. In this way, the garden itself became a living calendar, chronicling the seasons and guiding the work of generations. Peter paused beside the lovage, noticing the tender shoots just beginning to rise. He whispered softly, acknowledging the passage of time and the wisdom inherent in the cycles of growth. Every leaf, every stalk, Every tendril responded to light, temperature, and moisture, an orchestra playing a song older than any human memory. The seasons also shaped the human experience in the monastery. Meals, chores, and prayers followed the rhythm of nature, aligning daily life with the garden's cycles. Monks rose early to tend spring shoots, worked steadily through summer, measured their harvest in autumn, and spent winter planning for the next cycle. Life, like the garden, was a careful balance of patience, observation, and harmony with the unseen forces of nature. Peter reflected on the continuity of this rhythm. Generations of gardeners, women and men alike, had attuned themselves to these patterns. They had learned the subtle cues, the first hint of warmth in the soil, the early buds on the perennials, the lengthening of days, and their work became an extension of the song that nature sang quietly each year. The sound of birds returning in spring, the hum of insects in summer, and the rustle of leaves in autumn all became notes in this seasonal symphony. Even the snow and frost of winter contributed, insulating roots and preparing the garden for new growth. Peter often thought of it as the most patient and enduring music, a melody that repeated endlessly with variation, teaching those who listened the art of observation and timing. In summer, the garden flourished, tall stalks of rhubarb, lovage reaching for sunlight, asparagus spears standing proud, all moved in a gentle dance with the wind. Peter tended the garden carefully, harvesting only what could be spared, leaving the rest to continue growing in harmony with the rhythm of the season. Autumn brought color, crisp air, and measured harvests. Peter gathered leeks, peas, and the last of the asparagus. Always mindful of the plant's needs for the coming winter, he layered straw, applied compost, and protected the roots, ensuring that the garden would awaken anew with the first warmth of spring. The monks, guided by the song of the seasons, understood that their labor was part of a larger cycle. Life and growth were not to be hurried. Abundance came in its own time. The garden taught patience, endurance, and the profound interconnectedness of all living things. Peter walked along the rows, touching leaves and stems, feeling the pulse of the garden. Each plant, each perennial, responded to the cycle of seasons with unwavering fidelity. Their growth was a quiet reminder that life persisted, renewed, and continued, even in the face of challenges. Even the smallest signs mattered. A sprout breaking soil, a bud forming, a leaf unfurling. These subtle markers guided the gardeners, telling them when to act and when to wait. Through these observations, the song of the seasons became an unspoken language, teaching patience and attentiveness. As evening fell, the sun cast long shadows across the garden. Peter lingered among the beds, watching the interplay of light and leaf, root and soil. The rhythms of spring, summer, autumn, and winter played out continuously, unseen yet palpable, shaping the lives of the plants and the people who tended them. He thought of the generations of hands that had followed this song before him, planting, tending, harvesting, and observing. And he understood that the continuity of the garden depended not just on the perennials themselves, but on the human caretakers who harmonized their work with nature's quiet music. By nightfall, the garden was bathed in moonlight, silvering leaves and casting gentle shadows on the stone pots. The song of the seasons continued, subtle and eternal, marking time, guiding growth, and sustaining life. Peter walked slowly through the garden, heart full of reverence for the enduring rhythm, knowing that it would continue long after any individual gardener had passed. And in that quiet, moonlit calm, he could almost hear the song clearly. The rise of spring shoots, the summer growth, the autumn harvest, and the winter rest, a melody that repeated endlessly, teaching the art of patience, observation, and harmony with the cycles of life. The sleep of winter garden lay silent beneath a blanket of frost, the stone pots glistening in the pale winter light. Peter walked slowly, his breath forming gentle clouds in the cold air, listening to the faint crackle of ice and the distant call of a lone bird. Above ground, the perennials appeared dormant, their leaves withered or covered in frost, their stalks bent low under the weight of winter. Yet beneath the surface, life persisted, roots storing energy, quietly waiting for spring's warmth. The monks called this period the sleep of winter, a time when the garden rested and the world slowed. It was a season of reflection, patience, and preparation. Though the plants seemed still, their roots and bulbs worked steadily in silence, preserving the promise of renewal. Peter knelt beside the asparagus bed, brushing away a layer of frost to glimpse the tender shoots below. Though the stems above were stiff and lifeless, the roots pulsed with quiet vitality, resilient against the harsh chill. He marveled at the endurance of life beneath the frozen earth, an invisible testament to patience and perseverance. The perennials had evolved to withstand winter's sleep. Leeks, lovage, rhubarb, and peas each carried within them a store of energy, a hidden promise that the next season would bring growth once again. The garden, in its winter dormancy, reminded humans that stillness was not death but a preparation for life renewed. Peter moved slowly among the beds, noting the careful layers of straw, compost, and protective coverings that shielded the roots from frost. Generations of monks and villagers had learned the art of winter care, when to mulch, how to layer, and how to leave some protection for seeds that would awaken with spring. It was a quiet labor, patient and methodical, requiring attention to details that often went unnoticed. Even the oldest trees and shrubs obeyed this rhythm, their branches, bare and skeletal against the winter sky, concealed the enduring life within. Peter placed a hand against the rough bark of a lovage plant, feeling the slow pulse of survival beneath the surface. It was humbling to witness life persevering so quietly, so persistently. Winter was also a time of observation and learning. The monks studied the garden's endurance, noting which plants thrived despite cold and frost, which roots needed additional protection, and how the cycles of freezing and thawing affected growth in the coming year. Through these observations, they developed strategies for sustainability, ensuring that perennial crops would continue to provide sustenance year after year. Peter paused by a bed of rhubarb, its leaves curled and frost-kissed. He thought of the gardeners who had planted these roots decades before, guiding them through countless winters. Their knowledge, passed quietly from one generation to the next, ensured that the garden's sleep was not mere inactivity, but a carefully orchestrated pause. In life's rhythm, the winter silence carried its own lessons. It taught patience, humility, and trust in the cycles of nature. The perennials, though hidden and still, reminded the gardeners that growth cannot be forced, and that abundance comes to those who wait. In the kitchen, the impact of winter care became evident. Though fresh harvests were scarce above ground, preserved roots and hardy vegetables provided nourishment through the cold months. The wisdom of planting perennials, crops that could endure winter's sleep, was reflected in each hearty meal prepared with care and gratitude. Peter knelt once more, brushing snow from the soil to observe the roots below. Even in dormancy, life was active, slowly drawing nutrients, maintaining structure, and preparing for the rebirth that would arrive with spring. It was a quiet miracle, one that often went unnoticed by those who only saw the barren garden above. The monks sometimes spoke of winter as a teacher, showing them the value of rest and preparation. Just as the garden needed time to store energy and await warmth, humans too required pauses for reflection, observation, and quiet work that nurtured the future. Peter walked along the frost-lined paths, watching the early morning sun glint off the icy leaves. He noticed the subtle shifts in light and shadow, the intricate patterns of frost crystals on the ground, and the quiet activity of small creatures seeking warmth beneath the soil. Even in the coldest months, life persisted, often hidden but always present. The perennials had their own internal clocks, responding to the shortening days, dropping temperatures, and reduced sunlight. Roots slowed, energy was conserved, and buds that had formed in late summer remained dormant. This deep, slow rhythm was essential to their survival, ensuring that when spring arrived, growth would resume with vigor and precision. Peter paused near the peas, their delicate tendrils barely visible beneath a layer of straw. He reflected on the centuries of gardeners who had tended these perennials, learning when to prune, when to cover, and when to leave the soil untouched. Through careful winter preparation, they preserved life and ensured continuity for generations, even in the harshest storms. When snow blanketed the garden and frost stiffened every leaf, the work of winter was evident. Layers of protection, careful composting, and patient observation allowed perennials to survive and thrive. Peter admired the foresight and care embedded in these practices, recognizing that survival depended on attention to what is often unseen. The winter garden was also a place of reflection. Peter walked slowly, listening to the quiet, observing the subtle signs of life beneath the frozen surface. He understood that this stillness was as important as the bustling activity of spring and summer. It was the foundation upon which all growth depended. He knelt to brush snow from the leeks, revealing the sturdy stalks beneath. Even in apparent dormancy, the plants were alive, drawing from stored nutrients and waiting patiently for warmth and sunlight. It was a gentle reminder that time, care, and quiet endurance are essential in all aspects of life. The work of winter care extended beyond the garden. Paths were cleared, tools maintained, and compost prepared for the coming season. Every action, though seemingly small, ensured the continuity of growth and the enduring harvest of perennials. Peter walked past the lovage, leeks, and asparagus beds, noting the quiet majesty of a garden in winter. Though the vibrant colors of spring were absent, there was beauty in the frost, strength in the roots, and promise in the dormancy. The garden rested, yet life persisted, hidden beneath the surface, patiently awaiting renewal. By evening, the frost deepened, and the garden lay silent under the silver light of the moon. Peter lingered, feeling the pulse of life beneath his hands and feet. The sleep of winter was not an absence, but a preparation, a careful, deliberate pause that ensured the garden would awaken once again with vitality and abundance. Even as night deepened, the roots worked quietly, storing energy, maintaining resilience, and sustaining life. Peter understood that this hidden activity was as vital as the visible growth of spring and summer. Winter, in its quietude, preserved the continuity of life. He traced the paths one last time, pausing to admire the frost-covered perennials. Every plant, every root, and every bed reflected centuries of care, patience, and understanding. The sleep of winter was a testament to endurance, a gentle reminder that stillness and observation are essential to life's rhythm. And as he left the garden, the moonlight casting long shadows across the frost, Peter whispered a silent gratitude to the perennial crops, the gardeners of centuries past, and the quiet wisdom of winter itself, a season of rest, reflection, and enduring promise. A world without wasted sun rose softly over the medieval garden, its rays glinting off the dew-laden leaves of leeks, rhubarb, lovage, and asparagus. Peter walked along the familiar stone paths, observing the neat rows of plants and the compost heaps that nourished them in this garden. Nothing was wasted. Every leaf, every peel, and every scrap had a purpose, quietly sustaining life and ensuring continuity. The monks called it a world without waste, a philosophy that extended beyond the garden into daily life. Food scraps became compost, water was reused, and the smallest remnants of plant life were transformed into nourishment for future growth. Even the simplest acts of care reflected a deep respect for resources and the cycles of life. Peter paused beside a compost pile, brushing his fingers through the rich, dark soil. This pile had been carefully layered with vegetable peelings, wilted leaves, and even ash from the hearth. Over time, it would become fertile soil, sustaining the perennials for seasons to come. It was a slow, quiet process, invisible to most, yet essential to the health of the garden. In the kitchen, no scrap went unused. Wilted greens were simmered into broths. Peels and cores were fed to livestock or composted for the soil. The careful stewardship of resources created a balance, ensuring that every element of life, plant, animal, and human, contributed to the cycle of renewal. Peter walked to the rhubarb bed, admiring the thick, vibrant stalks. He thought of the countless hands that had tended these roots for decades, carefully harvesting only what could be spared and leaving enough for the plant to continue growing. It was a practice that demanded patience, mindfulness, and foresight, a conscious effort to preserve abundance without depletion. The monks often emphasized the importance of observation by paying attention to what was used, what was left behind, and what could be transformed. They learned to create a sustainable system where nothing was wasted. The garden, in this way, became both teacher and testament to a philosophy of care and balance. Peter knelt to examine the soil beneath the lovage, noting how compost and careful mulching had enriched the earth. He marveled at how seemingly small, overlooked materials, wilted leaves, straw, peelings, could transform into vital nutrients. It was alchemy of a practical sort, turning remnants into life-sustaining power. Even the water system in the garden reflected a philosophy of minimal waste. Rainwater was collected in barrels, diverted through channels to irrigate beds, and reused wherever possible. No drop was squandered. Each contributed to the vitality of the plants and the health of the soil. Peter remembered an autumn when a particularly dry season had challenged the garden. The careful reuse of water, combined with compost-enriched soil, allowed the perennials to survive and thrive. It was a quiet triumph, evidence of centuries of accumulated knowledge and careful stewardship. The philosophy extended beyond plants to include human behavior. The monks cultivated mindfulness in their daily actions, careful use of firewood, preservation of food, and thoughtful tending of every garden bed. In a world without waste, every action, no matter how small, had meaning. Peter walked among the beds, brushing leaves with his fingertips, observing how the perennials responded to care and attention. He realized that wastefulness had never been an option in these gardens. Survival and abundance depended on careful observation, foresight, and balance. Even fallen leaves and plant detritus were valuable. They were gathered, layered, and left to decompose into compost, enriching the soil and sustaining life through the coming seasons. Nothing was discarded. Everything was transformed into nourishment, growth, and continuity. The perennials themselves reflected this philosophy. Leeks, good King Henry, rhubarb, and asparagus returned year after year, sustained by the careful reuse of resources and mindful harvesting practices. Their endurance was a living example of how attention to detail and respect for life ensured lasting abundance. Peter, paused by a bed of perennial peas. Noting the intertwined tendrils and healthy pods, he thought of the generations of gardeners, men and women alike, who had nurtured this patch with care, ensuring that the plants could continue producing for decades. Every action, from layering compost to precise watering, contributed to a system in which nothing went to waste. Even the smallest kitchen scraps held value. A carrot top, a wilted cabbage leaf, or a broken stem could be returned to the soil to feed roots, enrich compost, or nourish animals. This careful stewardship reflected a mindset that saw abundance as a shared responsibility, not a finite resource to be consumed without thought. Peter observed the winter layers of mulch that protected tender roots, preventing frost damage and preserving life beneath the cold. He thought of how past gardeners had learned to turn fallen leaves, straw, and organic matter into protective coverings, a practice that ensured survival through harsh seasons. The garden, in all its careful design and use of resources, embodied a quiet philosophy. Every element had purpose, and every action contributed to the cycle of life. Waste was not absence or loss, but opportunity to nourish, to sustain, and to prepare for the next cycle of growth. Peter walked slowly along the garden paths, observing the thriving perennials, the compost piles, and the careful water channels. He felt a sense of calm satisfaction, knowing that the garden was not only a place of growth and abundance, but also a testament to the wisdom of living in harmony with the cycles of nature. Even the smallest touches mattered: a carefully pruned stem, a layer of mulch, or the addition of composted peelings ensured that the garden continued to thrive. Every detail, every minor effort, was a thread in the intricate tapestry of sustainability. Peter knelt beside the lovage once more, feeling the rich soil and tracing the roots beneath. It was humbling to recognize that every plant, every root, every leaf had been nurtured with intention, respect, and care. In this world without waste, life persisted, enriched by the smallest contributions and sustained by generations of mindful stewardship. By evening, the sun cast long shadows across the garden, highlighting the lush greenery of leeks, rhubarb, and asparagus. Peter walked slowly along the stone paths, reflecting on the lessons of sustainability, patience, and continuity. Every element of the garden, soil, plant, water, compost, worked together in harmony, ensuring that abundance could endure for centuries. And as the moon rose over the medieval garden, Peter felt a profound gratitude for the quiet wisdom embedded in every corner of the space. The careful use of resources, the attentive hands of generations, and the enduring life of perennials that had been planted once and continued to give forever. The forgotten lessons. The first light of morning shimmered on the frost-kissed leaves of the garden, and Peter walked slowly along the stone paths, letting his gaze drift over the rows of leeks, lovage, rhubarb, asparagus, and perennial peas. Each plant told a story of generations of care, patient observation, and timeless knowledge. Yet, many of these lessons had been forgotten in the modern rush of life. Buried beneath the pace of change and convenience, Peter knelt beside the perennial rhubarb, brushing the cold soil from its base. He reflected on how the monks had once taught that plants, like people, respond to patience, attention, and respect. Rush the process, and the garden falters. Nurture it with quiet care, and the harvest endures for generations. The perennials were living teachers. Their deep roots, returning growth year after year, carried lessons that humans could only learn through careful observation and repeated tending. Each leaf, stalk, and blossom spoke of continuity, resilience, and the quiet power of persistence. Peter recalled the monastery records, where subtle hints about planting cycles, soil care, and perennial maintenance were inscribed. Though written in simple language, they conveyed profound wisdom. The timing of harvests, the layering of compost, the careful rotation of crops, all practices that ensured the survival and thriving of the garden over decades. In the busy modern world, these lessons had often been overlooked. People sought instant results, fast growth, and immediate yield, forgetting that perennials thrived in harmony with time and patience. The monks and villagers of the medieval gardens understood the slow rhythm of life, that true abundance required observation, care, and respect for natural cycles. Peter moved to the Lovage patch, observing the tall, sturdy stalks that had persisted through countless seasons. They were a testament to centuries of careful tending, a reminder that thoughtful labor produces enduring results. The forgotten lesson, he realized, was that life, like a perennial garden, flourishes only when nurtured with patience, diligence, and mindfulness. The compost piles told a similar story. They transformed what was discarded, wilted leaves, kitchen scraps, and straw, into nourishment for future growth. This quiet alchemy, unnoticed by many, preserved the continuity of life. It was a lesson in resourcefulness, patience, and understanding the cycles of decay and renewal. Peter recalled stories of Sister Agnes, who had tended the garden for decades. Her knowledge of soil, roots, and perennials was intuitive, yet precise. She taught that observation, repetition, and attention to detail were as vital as sunlight and water. These lessons, although simple, had been forgotten by those who valued speed over depth. Even the winter garden whispered these teachings. Beneath the frozen soil, roots persisted, drawing nutrients and conserving energy. The silence of winter was not absence, but preparation. It was a lesson that stillness and patience were essential for long-term abundance. Peter knelt beside the asparagus bed, feeling the frozen soil beneath his fingers. He marveled at the resilience of the plants, and at the knowledge that previous gardeners had embedded in the soil. Mulching, composting, and strategic protection, all subtle practices ensured survival through harsh seasons. These were lessons forgotten in a world eager for immediacy, yet timeless in their effectiveness. The perennials themselves embodied the wisdom of cycles and continuity. Leeks returning year after year, good King Henry spreading generously, rhubarb thriving with minimal intervention. Each plant was a living archive of the lessons once taught by medieval gardeners. Peter realized that the most enduring knowledge is often quiet, subtle, and only visible to those who take the time to observe. Even above ground, the garden communicated the importance of restraint and observation. Harvesting too much too soon weakens perennials, just as impatience in human endeavors can diminish long-term success. The forgotten lesson was that abundance is sustained not by immediate gratification, but by careful stewardship, foresight, and measured action. Peter walked slowly, touching leaves and stems, reflecting on how each plant carried the wisdom of centuries. The garden was a repository of forgotten knowledge. That roots must be respected, soil nurtured, compost valued, and growth observed with patience. This knowledge had allowed humans to cultivate abundance in harmony with nature, rather than in opposition to it. The women who tended the garden for decades had internalized these lessons through experience. Their careful hands, repeated observation, and thoughtful harvesting ensured that the perennials persisted. They understood, often instinctively, that the long-term health of the garden required patience, respect, and minimal interference. Even the compost heap was a teacher. What humans might discard as waste became the lifeblood of future growth. Peter ran his fingers through the dark, rich soil, feeling the subtle warmth of decomposition. It was a quiet, almost magical reminder that endings lead to beginnings, decay leads to nourishment, and neglect leads to loss. The garden also reminded Peter of the interconnectedness of all things. Every plant depended on soil, compost, water, sunlight, and the care of humans. Every small action, repeated over time, had lasting consequences. This lesson, often forgotten, was essential to the survival of perennial gardens across centuries, even in the harshest years. When storms, droughts, or frost challenged growth, the garden persisted. Roots endured, leaves regrew, and harvests returned year after year. It was a testament to the forgotten lessons of patience, observation, and respect for natural cycles. Peter paused beside the perennial peas, running his fingers along the delicate tendrils. He thought of the generations of gardeners who had observed the rhythm of planting and harvest, the timing of pruning, and the layering of compost. These subtle acts, repeated across decades, ensured continuity and resilience. The garden, in all its quiet beauty, was a living library. It preserved knowledge that words alone could not convey, wisdom encoded in roots, leaves, soil, and cycles of growth. Those who observed carefully could read its lessons. Those who hurried past would miss them entirely. Peter walked among the beds, touching stems and leaves, absorbing the lessons embedded in centuries of careful tending. He understood that the greatest wisdom is often silent, present only in the patient observation of life's rhythms. These were the lessons that time had taught, and that modern hands too often forgot. By evening, the garden was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Peter lingered among the perennials, feeling their enduring presence, their quiet resilience, and the centuries of knowledge they carried. The forgotten lessons were not lost. They waited for those who would slow down, observe, and learn from the enduring rhythm of perennial life. And as night descended, with moonlight casting gentle shadows across the frost-kissed soil, Peter whispered a silent gratitude for the wisdom embedded in every root, leaf, and stalk, lessons forgotten by many, yet preserved quietly in the eternal garden. The legacy beneath our feet. Peter walked softly along the stone paths of the medieval garden, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the frost-dusted beds of leeks, lovage, rhubarb, asparagus, and perennial peas. Each step reminded him that beneath his feet lay centuries of life, labor, and wisdom, a legacy encoded in the soil itself. The ground was more than mere dirt. It was a living archive, layer upon layer of compost, decayed leaves, and plant matter preserved the memory of generations of gardeners who had tended these perennials with patience and care. Every root that had sunk into the soil, every seed that had been planted and harvested, had contributed to this living history. Peter knelt to brush away a thin layer of frost from the earth. He imagined the countless hands that had worked this soil, women and men who had kneaded it, enriched it, and nurtured it so that the garden could thrive year after year. The soil itself was a storyteller, holding the invisible traces of lives long past. The perennials above ground were only part of the story. Beneath the surface, roots intertwined with decaying organic matter, creating a dense network that sustained growth, preserved nutrients, and carried the wisdom of centuries. It was a reminder that true legacy is often hidden, visible only to those who look carefully. Peter touched the soil beneath the asparagus bed, feeling its firmness and richness. It was a testament to careful stewardship, layers of compost, the gradual breakdown of plant matter, and centuries of patient tending had produced earth capable of sustaining life indefinitely. This was the hidden continuity of the medieval garden, a quiet lesson in resilience and foresight. The monks had understood this deeply. They observed that soil, like memory, retained the imprint of care and attention by enriching it. Rotating crops and layering compost, they preserved not just the perennials above, but the foundation of life itself, ensuring that each planting could draw upon the accumulated wisdom of generations. Peter's gaze traveled along the beds of good King Henry and perennial peas. He traced the network of roots beneath, imagining how each layer of soil held a record of harvests, of pruning, of careful observation. The legacy beneath their feet was as enduring as the perennials themselves, a silent testament to human diligence and respect for nature. Even in winter, when the garden appeared dormant, the soil preserved its memory. Roots remained active beneath the frost, drawing upon stored nutrients and preparing for spring. Peter knelt to feel the subtle warmth of decomposition, sensing the quiet, unbroken rhythm of life beneath the surface. The women who had tended the garden for decades, often quietly and unseen, had contributed enormously to this legacy. Their careful pruning, layering of compost, and mindful harvesting ensured that the soil remained fertile, resilient, and prepared for future generations. Peter reflected on how often such contributions went unnoticed, yet they were encoded in every handful of earth. Compost, mulch, and organic matter were not merely tools of fertility. They were vessels of history. Each decomposed leaf, peel, and stalk carried information about the season, the care it had received, and the environment in which it had grown. The soil was alive with accumulated experience, a living memory of human interaction with nature. Peter knelt beside the lovage, brushing his fingers along the base of its stalks. He felt the soil beneath his hands, rich, loamy, and full of the unseen labor of centuries. It was humbling to realize that the thriving garden above ground relied entirely on this hidden legacy beneath, a delicate balance maintained through observation, patience, and care. Even the smallest signs of life in the soil told a story. A worm burrowing through compost, a tiny sprout breaking through, or the subtle network of microsal threads connecting roots all reflected continuity and endurance. Peter understood that these unseen connections had been cultivated and preserved by generations of meticulous hands. The monks recorded observations about soil quality, crop rotation, and layering techniques, often in simple manuscripts. These notes, passed down and practiced, reinforced the lessons embedded in the earth itself, that sustainability, patience, and careful tending were essential to enduring abundance. Peter marveled at how the physical soil and written knowledge intertwined, creating a foundation that endured far longer than the lifetimes of any individual gardener. Peter moved to the rhubarb bed, lifting a leaf to observe the tender stalks beneath. Each plant's roots were intertwined with centuries of compost and organic matter, forming a living testament to human stewardship. The legacy beneath their feet was unbroken, a silent bridge connecting past, present, and future gardeners. Even as storms came and seasons shifted, the soil preserved its lessons. Flooding, drought, and frost challenged the garden, yet the careful layering of nutrients and compost ensured resilience. The perennials survived and thrived, nourished by centuries of accumulated wisdom embedded in the ground. Peter knelt again, tracing the rich loam with his fingers. He thought of the countless harvests, careful prunings, and attentiveness that had contributed to this legacy. The perennial's abundance was not a miracle, but the result of careful, deliberate action carried out over generations. The garden, in its visible beauty, was only half the story. The soil beneath told the rest, a record of diligence, observation, and thoughtful care that allowed the plants to endure and flourish. Peter understood that the greatest legacies are often unseen, yet profoundly influential. Even the smallest seeds contributed to this hidden history. When saved, planted, and nurtured, they carried forward the lessons of survival, adaptation, and resilience embedded in the soil. Peter marveled at how such tiny beginnings could support life that would persist for decades, or even centuries. Peter walked slowly along the paths, feeling the subtle undulations of the earth beneath his feet. Each mound, each bed, each trace of cultivation reflected centuries of interaction between humans and nature. The garden was a living archive, a chronicle of care preserved in roots, soil, and perennials. Even the compost piles reflected this continuity. Layers of organic matter decomposed slowly, enriching the soil and preserving the lessons of sustainability. Peter marveled at how the seemingly mundane act of composting ensured the survival and vigor of the garden for generations. By evening, the garden lay bathed in soft twilight. Peter lingered, observing the perennials and the rich soil beneath them. He realized that the true legacy of the garden was not in the plants alone, but in the earth that carried centuries of wisdom, the quiet work of gardeners past, and the continuity of life preserved in the hidden networks of roots and soil. And as night descended, the moonlight illuminating the garden, Peter whispered a silent gratitude for the hidden legacy beneath their feet, for the soil that preserved the work of generations, the perennials that thrived because of it, and the timeless lessons of patience, care, and continuity encoded in the earth itself. They planted once, and so should Peter walked through the quiet garden as the first light of dawn warmed the frost-covered leaves. Every plant, leeks, lovage, rhubarb, asparagus, good King Henry, perennial peas, stood as a testament to centuries of care, observation, and patience. He breathed deeply, inhaling the earthy aroma of soil, the subtle fragrance of lovage, and the faint sweetness of rhubarb. The garden was alive, not merely with its visible greenery, but with the enduring legacy of those who had planted, tended, and preserved it for generations. As Peter paused beside the asparagus bed, he reflected on the quiet, persistent work that had made this abundance possible. Centuries ago, hands had first planted these perennials, investing in a future they would never fully see. They had worked slowly and carefully, attuned to the rhythms of the seasons, respecting the cycles of growth, dormancy, and renewal. Their wisdom was embedded not only in the plants above ground but in the soil, roots, and compost beneath. The lesson was clear. Meaningful work, patience, and foresight create enduring impact. Just as the medieval gardeners had planted once and reaped benefits for generations, modern hands could take similar action. It was a call to mindfulness, a reminder that small, intentional efforts today could ripple forward, sustaining life, abundance, and continuity far into the future. Peter walked past the perennial peas, their tendrils climbing trellises with quiet determination. Each plant carried the memory of decades of care, careful pruning, thoughtful watering, and strategic harvesting. Even as seasons passed and gardeners came and went, the perennials endured, thriving in the soil enriched by centuries of attentive stewardship. He knelt to touch the soil, feeling its richness and subtle warmth. It was remarkable to realize that a single planting, thoughtfully nurtured, could sustain life for decades. The lesson was both simple and profound. Planting once, with care and foresight, can yield a harvest far beyond what immediate observation might reveal. Peter's mind wandered to the monastery records, filled with notes about composting, layering mulch, crop rotation, and planting times. They emphasized harmony with the natural rhythms of life, observing seasons, conserving resources, and nurturing perennials. The wisdom, once taken for granted, had endured because it was grounded in patience, observation, and the long-term view. It was a philosophy that modern life had largely forgotten, yet it remained relevant, timeless, and urgent. He reflected on the winter garden, now resting beneath frost and snow, even in apparent dormancy. The perennials prepared silently for renewal. The same principle applied to human effort, careful planting and tending, even when unseen or unrecognized, could produce remarkable results over time. Peter walked slowly to the rhubarb patch, gently brushing back the frost to reveal vibrant stalks underneath. He marveled at how these plants had endured storms, droughts, frost, and decades of change. Their resilience was rooted not in luck, but in careful stewardship, mindful observation, and the deliberate practices of gardeners long past. The lesson echoed through time. The most enduring work is quiet, consistent, and thoughtful. He thought of the women and men who had devoted their lives to this garden. They had learned to observe subtle shifts in growth, to layer compost and mulch, and to harvest with restraint. Their actions ensured that the perennials thrived year after year, providing sustenance, beauty, and continuity. And yet, they had done so without expectation of personal reward, trusting that their labor would benefit those who came after them. Peter wandered along the stone paths, past lovage, leeks, and asparagus, reflecting on the continuity of life embedded in this space. Every root, every leaf, every trace of compost was a testament to long-term vision. He realized that modern life, often focused on immediate results, could learn much from this philosophy. The power of patience, the value of tending carefully, and the enduring impact of thoughtful action. The garden taught him another lesson. Abundance is nurtured, not demanded. The perennials did not flourish when pulled, plucked, or over-harvested. They responded to care, attention, and respect, principles that applied not only to plants but to all forms of life. Peter knelt by the perennial peas, observing the intricate network of roots intertwined beneath the soil. These roots carried nutrients, history, and life from season to season. He thought about the generations of gardeners who had tended them, layer by layer, year by year, leaving a legacy embedded in the earth. It was humbling and inspiring, proof that a single, thoughtful act of planting can reverberate through time. He glanced at the compost heaps, carefully layered and maintained. Here, nothing was wasted. Even remnants of past seasons nourished the present and future. The philosophy of sustainability, patience, and careful stewardship was written in soil, roots, and perennials. It was a philosophy worth reclaiming, a lesson for modern life as much as it had been for medieval times. Peter rose and walked toward the edge of the garden, surveying the patchwork of green beds, stone pots, and humble compost piles. He saw a living metaphor for life. Deliberate effort, patient observation, and mindful care yield abundance far beyond immediate expectations. Those who planted once, with care, reaped benefits for generations, and now, in this quiet garden, he understood that the invitation extended to everyone. They, too, could plant, tend, and create enduring legacy. He imagined what it would mean for modern hands to follow this example, planting perennials, enriching soil, composting carefully, and working in harmony with the seasons. The garden became a bridge, connecting past wisdom to present action, teaching that thoughtful effort, patience, and respect for life endure beyond the span of a single lifetime. Peter knelt once more beside the leeks, feeling the soil and brushing his fingers against the roots. He closed his eyes and listened. The subtle rhythm of growth, the whisper of leaves in the wind, the quiet pulse of life beneath the earth. It was a song older than he could fully grasp, a melody that carried the lessons of centuries and invited him to join in its continuity. And then he whispered softly, "They planted once, and so should we." It was a gentle call to action, not hurried, not frantic, but deliberate, thoughtful, and full of respect for the rhythms of nature. To plant today was to honor the past, nurture the present, and provide for the future. As the sun rose higher, warming the garden, Peter walked the paths one last time, taking in the richness of life that had endured through centuries of care. The perennials, steadfast and resilient, stood as living proof that thoughtful planting, patient tending, and reverent stewardship create abundance that lasts beyond a lifetime. The garden, in all its quiet glory, offered a timeless lesson. Every action matters. Every seed has potential, and enduring harvests are born of care, patience, and continuity. Peter stepped back from the garden, heart full of quiet gratitude and inspiration. The medieval hands who had planted, tended, and preserved this garden had left more than perennials. They had left wisdom encoded in soil, roots, and cycles of growth, and now, in this moment, the lesson extended to him, and to anyone willing to listen. The song of the seasons, the rhythms of growth, the cycles of planting, dormancy, and renewal, all intertwined into a living testament that spans centuries. It was a song of patience, care, and enduring abundance, one that could continue if modern hands were willing to plant, nurture, and tend and sow beneath the gentle light of afternoon sun. Peter knelt one final time, feeling the soil, touching the roots, and listening to the quiet heartbeat of the garden. He understood that history was not only in books and stories, but in soil, leaves, and perennials. By planting, tending, and caring, each generation contributed to a legacy that could endure, a legacy that had begun once and could continue forever. Peter stood, smiled softly, and took one last slow walk along the garden paths, whispering a promise to the perennials and the soil beneath. We will plant, we will tend, and we will continue the harvest for generations yet to come. The garden stood in quiet glory, a timeless testament to patience, wisdom, and enduring care. And in that moment, Peter felt a deep, serene certainty that the act of planting once, with care, could indeed change the future, quietly, steadily, and forever.